Testing, testing. 1 2 1 2. Test, test. Is everything working? Are we live? He lives and he is live. He's here. Refresh. Hey, there he is. He's testing. There we go. Okay. Hello, hello. I was a little worried for a second because I was trying to get my mic and my Fugi to work, and neither would function for the longest time. It's been a while. It's been a while. Oh yeah, so reason as to why I had to delay this stream. This is upon thinking about it, this is possibly the most stereotypically Australian thing to have happened, but if you guys remember, over the past few weeks, this isn't, well, to those who've been watching me for a while, this isn't going to be anything new, but over the past few weeks, I've been having some pretty an awful time sleeping. I've also been waking up with persistent, headaches, runny nose, etc., etc. I'd have rashes on my face, and for the longest time, I thought that this was just spring doing its thing. And turns out, the actual reason might not have been, the pollen or anything like that, but the fact that for the past few weeks, I've been getting carpet bombed in my sleep by a giant moth in my room. And I found this out last night because as I was trying to fall asleep, it flew into my fucking ear. I want you guys to imagine for a second the sensation of drifting off to sleep, right? Or at least trying to, in the dark, right? You're just lying there, and all of a sudden this thing thwacks into your ear, and you hear the beating of wings against your lobes, and then it just, poof, disappears. Now, as you can probably imagine, that kind of shot my ability to fall asleep for a good while afterwards. I spent the next hour basically hunting around my room trying to kill that thing. At the end of the day, I did manage to catch it. It's currently sitting in a jar, but yeah, I do not wish that on anybody. The worst thing is, it was about the size, half the size of my pinky as well. So, Toaster, thank you for being a Footstool for 2 months. My man is fighting Radiance. I mean, a lot of you could probably tell, but the past little bit of time, my health hasn't been doing stellar. I apologize for having to rearrange the streams as often as I have been over the past few months especially. But, yeah, it's been not the best. But I'm crossing my fingers that things will get better in the future, in the near future. Mercurius, thank you for the gifted membership. Irfan Norfal. Hope you enjoy those emotes, and welcome to becoming a Footstool. Welcome to the club. Master, and thank you for the 5. Oh, wait. Yeah, Twitch is funny about the things that it chooses to moderate against, the things that it doesn't choose to moderate against. It's a sign that you should play Hollow Knight, a game made by Australians. You know what? Maybe that's why they decided to make every character some variation of giant insect. That would make a lot of sense, actually. But sweet, an EU time stream? Yes. Again, apologies to all of the Americans who are probably going to have to watch the VOD, because I'm assuming this is an unholy hour for all of you guys. But yeah, for the EU bros, small bit of comfort in that this is actually when you would normally be awake. I'll watch the VOD because I need to sleep early. No problem at all, Alan. No problem at all. I hope you enjoy it. Giant insects and roos. Yeah, that's pretty much the Australian. That's our ecosystem pretty much. The only important parts of it, anyways. Which is really making a case for being the worst company on the internet. It's impressive. I wouldn't go so far as to say the worst company on the internet, but certainly one of the worst platforms. And the thing is, the thing that makes it impressive in my eyes is the fact that in granting it that title, it's not just based on one thing, you know, features or moderation or overall direction, but a combination of all of those things at once. So you will need to endure 7 a.m. EDT USA here. Oh, that is. I suppose that's not too bad of an hour. That's not too bad of an hour. But yeah. Zoofield, thank you for being a Footstool for 8 months. I remember Tsunderia, especially Hoshino Charlotte. Yes. And again, actually, I'll touch on this once I get to the disclaimers, but I understand that for this topic in particular, I said as much in my announcement post, but I'm going to reiterate. To be upfront and honest with you guys, I'm not a Tsunderia fan. And I don't mean that in a sort of, you know, I don't mean that in a euphemistic passive-aggressive way or anything to imply that I dislike any of the talents or their content. I mean it in the literal sense of the phrase. I wasn't around at the time and I didn't watch their content as a fan. So, as a result of that, there are going to be limitations to my ability to talk about certain things. But again, I'm going to stick to what I normally do when it comes to streams like this. Stick to the stuff that I know. And that ties into the reason as to why I've segregated this stream into 2 parts. Master Ant, thank you for being a Footstool for 3 months. How's it feel to maybe be vindicated about Nano? Yeah, so I said earlier, I think last week, that, beginning of this week, that I was going to do a gorilla later on this week. And I was going to do the gorilla on the Cinder files, but upon thinking about it a little bit more, I reckon just separating that into its own stream proper would probably make more sense. So I'm going to be, the next week is going to be stream about the Cinder dog, basically circling back to some of the stuff that we discussed the first time we talked about things. And basically drawing connections and comparing the two, comparing what was speculated then versus what new evidence has been provided now. Also a critique on how it was presented. And on top of that, I am... Actually, those who have been keeping up with what I've been posting on Twitter, recently Murray announced that, Murray in chat has announced that at the end of the month on Halloween, we are going to be doing a collab stream with myself, Murray, and a whole bunch of other creators. We basically get together and tell a bunch of spooky stories, sing some songs, and basically just have a good time to celebrate spooky season. So I'll probably be doing a members-only stream sometime later on this week. Oh, sorry, next week. To sort of go through the process of working on my contribution to that as well. But yeah, it's going to be a great show. Amen, amen. TwitchCon must be a really weird event for some folks this weekend. I almost wish I was a fly on the wall. I don't know. I feel like TwitchCon has been interesting for the past few years. It certainly hasn't garnered the best reputation for itself, but I do hope everyone who's attending stays safe. Mercurius, thank you for the 2. Can I say how glad Cinder has returned? Sure. I mean, I think the idea of having her completely be exiled from the internet was always a bit fanciful. And frankly, I think if that had been the way that she was departing, I think that would have been in terms of the precedent it would have set for how disagreements are settled between individual content creators, I don't think that would have set a great one in hindsight. But again, all of that stuff I'm going to be touching on in next week's stream. Oh yes, Sawa is going to be a part of that, and I'm probably going to talk about it more in the member stream, but yeah, I'm looking forward to that. You can put the moth attack as a spooky story for Halloween. See, that's the thing. I need to embellish it because I feel like I've been desensitized to stuff like that because of the fact that I grew up here. So moth attacks are just annoying. not so much scary, just annoying. I was going to be singing, I'm looking forward to that. Amen, amen. Alright, so let me switch over to the slides. Okay. Let me just pull up. Go. Alright, is everything working? Can you guys see my... Okay, yep, it is. Alright. Ever gotten attacked by a drop there? At least once a week. At least once a week. I'm personally really happy that I can openly mention my distaste when it comes to how Nano acted with all of those cancelled projects. Yeah, and again, the manner in which she cancelled them was not exactly great either. And that's putting it very, very euphemistically. Alright, so, before we get into the main portion of this stream, I want to give a shout out and acknowledgement to user Porion on the Virtual Asylum for his detailed write-up on the history of Tsunderia. Now, this write-up was a crucial resource for me when I was trying to, learn a bit more about Tsunderia as an agency, how it rose, how it fell, the details associated with the various controversies that it went through while it was still a thing, and the ways in which the talents involved reacted to it. Now, for the purposes of this topic in general, I am not, similarly to the write-up itself, I'm not going to be touching on interpersonal dramas with any of the talents, and nor am I going to be including or discussing anything that I haven't been able to grab a primary source for myself. But if you want a quick rundown of the history of Tsunderia, especially one that has actually been written by a fan, I recommend going to check out Porion's write-up on the Virtual Asylum, contained in General Thread 2, and on page, I think that should say, I'll be finishing that, I'll complete that in the slides before I upload them onto Patreon, but yeah, the number is around 2,400, and I believe 26, though I may have misremembered. I'll be going back to check in any case, so. The Curse of the Crown, yeah. A little melodramatic a name, perhaps, but suitable. So before we get into the topic proper, few disclaimers. Number one, this is especially important for streams of this nature, where I'm going to be criticizing a bunch of things to do with how a company was run, or drawing connections between some of the red flags in Tsunderia and some of the signs of dysfunction that we've dissected in other companies that have risen and fallen since. Do not attempt to harass or contact any of the people or entities mentioned during this stream in any way, shape, or form. Everyone involved in Tsunderia, with Tsunderia, while it was still a thing, has moved on with their life. I very much doubt any of them are going to have any sort of interest in revisiting this topic whatsoever, least of all from, somebody else who was outside of the entire thing, and probably not someone in my content niche. So again, I ask that all of you maintain that distance, give that, extend that respect to them. If anyone, who was involved may be curious as to what I have to say in this stream, I would much, much prefer that they do so purely at their own discretion and at their own whims and will, rather than it be pushed into their attention by somebody from, this community. And I ask that you guys help me with ensuring that that remains the case, that they do get that choice, that distance, if they so wish. Page 2469, thank you, Murray. I'll amend that now. Alright. 2469. Thank you. Alright, so, on top of that, if I see any face begging in the chat, either while I'm live or when I'm reviewing the VOD, I may just have to summarily execute you. I don't make the rules. Well, I do, and that's one of the rules that we're going to be adopting for this stream. Second thing, all text, videos, and images shown during this stream are included for the purposes of critique and/or commentary and are thus protected under fair use. Third, all information/material shown over the course of this stream was posted and/or addressed by the subjects of this stream on a public platform and/or remains publicly available/traceable. Fourth, dates may be affected by time zones. And fifth, if there is something on screen that you can't quite make out, don't worry, I'll be narrating it out loud. And even if I don't, or if you want to go and revisit it, I'll be uploading all of the slides for this stream, as well as all of my previous streams and future streams, onto my Patreon, link in description. If you sign up as a free member, you don't need to pay anything. You can access the slides for all of my streams. And you can, download them, look through them at your own leisure. Oh, shit! Nasagi, welcome to the stream. Welcome in, welcome in. I still don't know about Tsunderia. I just remember Dizzy Ura April Fool's stream, and Dizzy describing the old company didn't sound like a bit. Sounded like it came from the heart and it was hell. Yeah, there are certain elements that, well, I'd say that's a pretty accurate descriptor of how things turned out. But in addition to this, while I'm still on this section of the stream dealing with disclaimers, I saw, Master N, I saw you bring this up. I saw that you brought this up in chat just then. But I do also want to say that, so when I made my tweet announcing this stream, it caught the attention of Lisa, Nightmare Sheep, former member of Tsunderia, Sundream, and current talent at Chroma Shift. And I will say that her reply to that post, where she basically talked about, how Tsunderia was, a topic that is near and dear to her own heart. I do want to say that in that reply to my post, she extended far more grace to my possible handling of this topic than my content niche warrants, to be quite frank. And while I am perhaps not as equipped to return that grace in kind, I do want to try. And as a result, again, I don't want to solicit people's time or attention under false pretenses. So, to anyone who may be watching this stream with perhaps some desire to go down memory lane or to experience a bit of nostalgia for times gone by, I want to make it very clear that this is not going to be so much a eulogy to the talents' time that they spent in Tsunderia, mostly because, to be completely honest, I do not trust myself to do that because I was not a fan. While I am committed, and I will certainly try my best to convey to essentially recap how Tsunderia fell as an agency, some of the signs of dysfunction that were observable from the outside looking in, and how it affected some of the talents, again, from what is archived and what has been made public. I am also going to be doing that through a very specific analytical lens. I'm going to be doing it in a manner similar to how I've done previous streams, talking about corporate implosions, which is to say that I'm going to be focusing on looking at things through a marketing perspective, a branding perspective, and an archival one. Specifically, I'm going to be I'm essentially going to try to prove a thesis, a conclusion that I've come to which inspired the creation of this stream in the first place, which is that the obscurity surrounding Tsunderia's collapse has whitewashed collective memory of the experiences of former talents, while also denying an important set of precedents by which people in this industry may judge similar signs of dysfunction in Tsunderia's contemporaries. Little bit wordy, possibly a little you may hear the second part where I talk about how Tsunderia is an important precedent that shouldn't be forgotten because it's to the detriment of the industry or the EN side of the industry in general. And you may think that's a bit hyperbolic, but I really do mean that genuinely. And so that is part of the reason why I have separated this stream into two parts. So the first part of my attempt at foraying into this topic is going to be talking about everything up until just after the debut of SunQuest. And essentially, this is a portion that is designed to demonstrate the manner in which I'm going to deal with this topic. The manner in which I will be dissecting it, analyzing it, and commentating over it. And so, if this is something that does not fall in line with what you were hoping for when you started watching or when you decided to watch this, I apologize if at all the manner in which I presented this premise was misleading. However, again, hopefully in splitting it this way, you have an idea as to what it is you're getting into if you've never watched my content before. And on the plus side, this is also going to be a good deal more digestible for people who don't usually watch my streams and the length that they go for. So again, for those who are a little unsure as to what this is going to be, I hope that gives you a little bit more of an idea as to why it's been arranged in the manner that it has been. Yeah, so one of the things that I've said in the past, I'm just going to reiterate here. I am not an advocate. I am not I have no illusions about being some sort of industry spokesperson or whatever. I am essentially the equivalent of a dog in a forensic team. But again, that is the premise of my content, and I want to try to be upfront about that. Usually that doesn't really need to be said, because again, this is the same principle that I've gone off of for all of my previous streams as well, especially those dealing with a similar topic, if not the same one. But I do want to hopefully be upfront about that with anyone who may be watching this who is not someone who regularly consumes my content. Just in case someone from someone formerly of Tsunderia does choose to tune in. So, Master Ren, thank you for the 2. Pippa follows you, Lisa tweeted you. I don't know about that one. But I think for a while we have qualified for micro celeb status. So, yeah, this is just again, it is an attempt at returning grace in kind. I am not exactly known for my tact nor for my sensitivity. But again, I hope to demonstrate in this stream what you can expect from my content. So, to start off with, like I pointed out just then, with the overarching premise, the conclusion that drew me into, deciding to do this stream and explore this topic in the first place. Over the past year and a half that I've been streaming, that we have done streams talking about various corporate implosions, talking about how various companies have collapsed in manners that exhibit dysfunction in similar ways, right? How there seem to be recurring themes in terms of corporate malpractice, overall, executive incompetence, etc., etc. There have emerged a series of red flags that we have been able to sort of pull out of all of these now dead companies based off of, how they operated while they were still active. And these red flags, some of them, the biggest ones, have been a CEO with an obvious lack of experience and or overstated qualifications. Now, again, the most recent and prominent example of this being VShojo, but before then, the example that I would always default to would be Nexus. Second, executives and or staff hired on the basis of association with the founders rather than qualifications for the job. Again, prominent recent example being VShojo. Third, talent management crossover, which generally, for reasons that we will get into later on, are usually not a good idea, and this is mostly because of the fact that when you try to combine those two roles, not only are they opposed in terms of their demands on the individual person, but they also tend to burn someone out at an exponential rate when they try to fulfill both roles to a high degree. Fourth, animosity between management and talents. Again, this is a bit of a no-brainer, but when it comes to examples of animosity between management and talents, again, this is something that is pretty important to take note of, that even though it may sound kind of obvious as a sign of dysfunction, has been overlooked in the past when we're dealing with companies that are in the process of collapsing but haven't completely collapsed yet. And finally, founding members leaving relatively soon into the company's establishment, which is usually a sign that something on the inside is probably not doing so great. The companies that use the two most obvious platforms for recruiting personnel, Reddit and League of Legends. Well, I mean, most of these companies started around, 4 or 5 years ago? I think back then you could probably get away with that, but good luck doing that nowadays. Nowadays, that really would be the death of a company before it even properly got started, I would wager. And so, the whole point of this is to reiterate that when it comes to recognizing red flags, their utility comes from their ability to give people enough room to, essentially see the storm coming, right? It allows people to utilize whatever prejudices they may have as a self-protective measure. Because after all, if you can spot those red flags, you don't need to wait around for the actual implosion. You can probably tell and start preparing a little bit earlier. And that is, for the large part, what my content has become. A series of streams and deep dives designed, at least in part, to give people the ability to develop those prejudices against certain behaviors, certain policies, certain practices, and to recognize them as a sign of impending dysfunction. However, the ability to recognize these red flags, the ability to form that innate protective prejudice, is dependent on having access to data. If you don't have data, you can't develop prejudice, or at least not accurate ones. And as a result, this is why a large part of what I believe to be important is archiving the failures of various companies and trying to essentially, taking note of when common themes, end up emerging between them. And to this end, one of the companies that has, for the most part, seemed to have been forgotten in terms of how it collapsed, in terms of the details of how it operated, etc., was, funnily enough, the very first EN agency to properly open up in the West, and that is Tsunderia. And the reason as to why, like I've mentioned before on stream, I think that this is something that is worth looking at and talking about, and more importantly, remembering, is because Tsunderia, in the way that it existed, was, for want of a better way of putting it, an archetypical example of many of the common failings in terms of failure to recover from controversy, failure to utilize an opportunity, failure to support its talents, that have since repeated themselves with an eerie degree of similarity across other companies that have since succeeded it. In other words, companies that managed to outlive it, despite some of them emerging at around the same time that Tsunderia emerged. And so, to start off with, this recount, this overview of how Tsunderia existed as a company, we have to start from April 4th of 2020, when a VTuber by the name of Kamiko Kana would create a little bit of an introduction video introducing herself, titled Kamiko Kana Introduces Herself. Basically all the classic things that you now associate with a VTuber debut, listing of interests and hobbies, height, name, etc, etc. Basically giving people a feel for what she was like as a content creator, as a VTuber specifically. Now, 2 days later, this would then be followed up by a second video announcing that she had been locked out of her original channel that was titled Kamiko Kana Channel, and she would now be moving over to a secondary channel called Kamiko Kana. This would permanently become her channel going forward, and still is her channel today. She still streams. And upon this move that was presumably compelled because of YouTube's customary tempestuousness, she began streaming quite regularly for around 3, 4, 5 times a week. And so, over the course of the first 2 months after her debut, she began putting out a steady series of streams, mostly gameplay streams, that focused on a wide variety of different games. This was a pretty impressive range in terms of the different types of content, different genres that she would end up covering on stream. You have RPGs, horror games, action adventure, hero shooters, life sims, autism, female autism, the works. A whole range of different things. Good deal of versatility, even while staying mostly within the overarching genre of content, which is just playing video games on stream. Then, in June 23rd of 2020, she would put up she would go live with another stream titled Today is My Birthday, also big announcement today, in which she would announce 2 things. First, that she would be getting a model update. She would now be going from a 3D model to a live 2D one. Well, as you can probably see, updated with all of the smugness that you could expect of a, little gawky like her. The second thing, though, and this was the more pertinent thing to today's topic, was that she had now joined a company. And that company was called Tsunderia Studios. Now, at this time, they were split between 2 different logos. They would end up picking one later, and again, we'll get into that in a bit. But this was the first public acknowledgement that Tsunderia existed. This was how Tsunderia announced its existence to the world. Now, without most people knowing it, Tsunderia had actually been created a good deal earlier, founded in April 27th of 2020, or at least that was when it was formally registered with the state of California. So, just over 3 weeks after Kana herself debuted. And when introducing this new company to her audience, one of the things that Kana shared was that Tsunderia was not going to have her as its only talent. They would be debuting as an agency with a starting generation of 3 individual talents. And the 2 talents, aside from Kana, who were going to be joining,
what would later on be christened as Gen Zero of Tsunderia were Hoshino Charlotte, otherwise referred to as Char, and Inukai Udin, both of whom would be making their official debuts under the agency at a later date. In the case of Charlotte, it was very soon after Kamiko Kana's debut under Tsunderia, or I should say re-debut under Tsunderia, because on June 28th, same week, Char would make her formal debut under Tsunderia with a stream of her own. And California is a red flag on its own. To be fair, there are a lot of companies that are registered in California in the US. So I don't think that in and of itself can be, I don't think that itself warrants being counted as a red flag. But over the course of this stream, one of the things that would be revealed is a little bit more as to Tsunderia's management structure and overall personnel. So, as you can see, there's three talents. You have Kana, you have Putin, you have Cha herself. But one of the things that Tsunderia did that was, at least in hindsight, quite unusual for most companies, something that isn't often officially and publicly declared nowadays, is the fact that Char was doing double duty, not just as a talent, but also as a part-time manager. And as to the other members of management, at this time, only two others were disclosed. PPP, who was the CEO and founder of the company, and someone by the name of S-Train, who was at this time, christened with the titles of Head Administrator and Head Moderator. Now, after her debut for her following streams, Char would end up adopting a similar degree of versatility and range when it comes to the types of streams that she would end up putting out, right? Gaming streams, horror games, intra-company collabs, inter-company collabs. One of the first collabs that Tsunderia did with other companies proper were with MyHoloTV and one other now defunct company called, I believe, Deep Productions or something along those lines. Again, we'll touch on that a bit more later. Karaoke streams, handcam streams. She even did one footcam stream. And so, in addition to, Mahjong Soul before it had its second wave of popularity because of FaZe in the VTubing sphere. But, again, this much is to say that, similar to Kana, she was also someone who exhibited a great deal of range in terms of the types of content that she would end up putting out. And then, next month, this should say July. Sorry, give me a second. On July 26th, Inukai Putin would end up making her debut under the company as well. And similarly to the two talents that preceded her, she would also end up putting out a good range of different types of stream content over the course of her channel. So, as usual, you have the customary gameplay streams, but also Zatsudans, karaokes, intra-company collabs, extra-company collabs, and even cultural enrichment collabs. I think she did a stream after this point multiple streams after this point actually, where she just spoke Tagalog. So, again, at this particular point in time, you have a small set, right? A small trio of VTubers, all of which exhibited, again, great degree of versatility in terms of their actual stream content. They seem to exhibit a degree of novelty in terms of the kinds of topics or the manner in which they would make their content as well. And again, together, these three would be christened Tsunderia's Gen Zero, and they would end up becoming the first official gen, English-speaking gen aimed at an English-speaking audience, that would be debuting under a company that was based in the West, or essentially just, based outside of Japan/Asia. And the reason why this was regarded as an achievement of great import, a sort of milestone for the EN side of the industry in general, was because the debut of Tsunderia's Gen Zero preceded even those of what was formerly referred to as the big three heavy hitters of the EN side of the VTubing industry, those being Hololive, VShojo, and Nijisanji. Hololive only debuted Holo Myth way back in, hold on, let me just do some counting. September, there we go, September, October, yeah, September of 2020, VShojo in November of 2020, and Nijisanji in July of 2021. Now, when I refer to Nijisanji EN, I of course refer to their first, well, not the repackaging of India, Niji India, but with the debut of Lazulite. So, when it comes to this position, there is a degree of cachet that comes along with being the first to do anything. Now, this is pretty self-explanatory, but when it comes to the whole idea of trying to create a corporate brand, there's a degree of benefit to possessing the kind of novelty that comes along with being the first to do something that isn't really, or at least in my opinion, isn't really acknowledged because of the fact that that benefit tends to fade over time. The thing is, when you possess that degree of novelty, usually as a company, right, when you're trying to turn that into some sort of lasting brand or, this thing that you can continue to generate profit off of, there are three different ways that you need to utilize it. You need to be able to convert it into three different things. The first is recruitment. Second is promotion. The third is commercialization. Recruitment is pretty easy to understand, right? If you are the first to do something, that usually puts you in a position where it is easier for you to advertise yourself, to build a reputation as an innovator, and try to get more people to join in on your project, right? To help you make your product, essentially. Now, with promotion, it is same principle, right? Generally, once you've recruited more people to help you make your product, then you can put more resources towards promoting said product. Now, in the case of VTubing, this is especially, the process from moving from recruitment to promotion is especially easy because the people you recruit double as the reason behind your promotion of your company, right? You recruit new talents, you promote those talents, and those talents also happen to be the tool that you use to promote your company, in addition to the product that you are promoting. So, in that regard, the transition tends to be relatively easy. And then finally, once you have promotion, you go from finding workers to finding an audience. And finally, what you need to do is figure out how to monetize that audience. And that's the final stage of, properly utilizing the novelty that you have been granted as a resource with which to build your brand, which is commercialization, right? Finding workers, finding an audience, and finally monetizing that audience. However, here's the thing. When it comes to conceptualizing the effect that novelty has on a brand, the benefits that it can provide to a brand or to any company looking to use it to build a brand, one of the ways in which I want you guys to try conceptualizing it is not just as this sort of static thing, this sort of passive buff, so to speak, but more so a resource. A resource that we can refer to as leverage. Because when you have novelty, you have that impression, that reputation for newness, for originality, for being an innovator, to use a bit of a tired term in marketing, that allows you to get away with certain things, right? That adds a degree of weight to what you say and what you promise. And that leverage tends to manifest in slightly different forms depending on which stage of the, conversion process you're at. When it comes to recruitment, the leverage that novelty gives you is that you now have a degree of cachet, or for want of a better way of putting it, clout. If you're the first to do something, you're the first to get that idea, people are automatically going to look at you as if you have something they don't, right? And that makes people more likely to trust you, and to be more likely to take a risk on trusting you. Second part, promotion. Novelty gives you a very easy way, gives you a very easy resource to exploit for the purposes of branding, right? for reasons that we will get into in more detail a little bit later. As you know, when it comes to branding, part of what makes a brand strong is the ability to differentiate yourself from your competitors. Being known for doing something never done before, being known for newness, originality, etc., etc. All of those things help significantly when it comes to trying to elevate yourself brand-wise above others who are offering a similar product. And finally, when you have something that is truly new, or at least can be perceived easily as being truly new, naturally, because you are the only one who is making such a product, it acquires a degree of scarcity. And basic rules of economics, scarcity creates value, and that is what novelty offers in the stage of commercialization, right? So in essence, if you are a VTuber company, you are offering a novel product in the sense that you are actually doing something that hasn't been done before, like, let's say, for example, being the very first EN-based agency to, well, create an entire talent roster that is designed to cater to an EN-speaking audience, you naturally have, these three different forms of leverage that you can then exploit to grow your operation. The problem is, though, and this is the thing that every single company in this space has to contend with in order to keep operating, is that leverage, this leverage that is provided by novelty, is not everlasting. It is not infinite. It is, in fact, the opposite. It decays over time. And what makes it decay? One very, the base reason is competition. Because when you come out with a product, right, when you come out with a product that is proven, or at least speculated, to be profitable, other people are going to come in and try to emulate that success. Other people are going to come in and try to implement the exact same methods that you use, operate in a similar manner, similar enough to, different enough to get away with in terms of not stirring up too much of a controversy or not getting in trouble with the law. And as a result, what ends up happening is usually when someone comes out with a novel idea in any industry, other actors move in, start copying it, and again, that novelty ends up decreasing over time as competition grows. Now, in terms of the different ways in which that the decreasing nature of that leverage manifests in terms of how it dictates what a company has to do in order to survive in a given space or in a given industry, I want to focus on one particular field, because I feel like with recruitment, it's pretty easy to see how decreasing novelty because you have more competitors sort of hampers your ability to utilize cachet in order to boost recruitment, right? If there are other companies, other actors who are providing a similar service to you, right? If there are, let's say there are other VTuber companies that are operating with the same premise, the same target audience, naturally, because there is now more choice, talents are going to be a bit more choosy when it comes to who they select to be recruited by. Same thing when it comes to commercialization. It's a pretty basic, pretty easy to see how simply having more actors in a space offering the same service or the same product decreases the value of said product. When you have multiple different companies all debuting their own VTubers at the same time, what that creates is, well, more often than not, choice paralysis in the audience, where they are confronted with so many different options that it becomes difficult for them to, value, choose, elevate above all others, one in particular. And again, this is what you need to contend with as a company looking to utilize this benefit while you still have it in the palm of your hand. However, when it comes to branding, there is a very specific way in which the leverage offered by novelty tends to decay over time, and a very specific thing that a company generally has to do in order to overcome that loss of leverage over time. Now, for the benefit of those who may not have encountered my content before, or who may not have tuned into prior streams where I talk about the same subject, the definition of branding that we are operating on, one of the official more academic definitions of it that have been offered by some of the various papers that have been written over the decades on this subject, is that branding is a primarily communicative process that involves the efforts of corporations to shape human identity and influence the cultural and social landscape to sell consumer products. Now that is just a wall of text, right? Full of slop that most people would instantly sort of dissociate with when they read it, because it's written in a very, academically heavy way. However, essentially what that breaks down to is, while you may roll your eyes and go, at the idea that branding, something as simple as just, corporate marketing, can be some sort of attempt at shaping the way that people see themselves or influence a quote-unquote cultural and social landscape to sell consumer products. The reasons to why branding has been conceptualized in this manner is because those are the two forces that primarily drive whether someone buys your product, namely how they conceptualize its value to them specifically, so that's the human identity part of this definition, and how does it measure up relative to the other competitors that exist around it, which is the cultural and social landscape surrounding both the product and the consumer looking to buy it. And this all ties into the two components of what a brand even is. Because when you're looking at a brand, it needs two parts in order to function. The first part is identification, right? In other words, value in a vacuum, an objective value in terms of what does it actually give to the consumer, to the viewer, etc., etc. If you look at the product in and of itself, how does it satisfy needs and wants, right? And this part of the brand deals with, what is it, right? What is the brand? What do they do? What do they offer to the consumer on a one-to-one basis? The second part of a brand, and this is the part that it's still acknowledged, but it's less discussed, is differentiation. Value not in a vacuum, but in context, aka the perceived value of a good. How does it stack up against competitors? How does it stack up around what exists around it, right? So this mostly consists of a brand trying to outline to possible consumers what we are not, what we don't do, basically pointing to the competition and trying to draw a line in between the brand in question and its competitors. Now, I've used over the time that I've been streaming, that I've been talking about this topic, I've used various different framing devices to try and help with the conceptualization as to how these two aspects of a brand work together in order to create one coherent thing that helps you sell something. But one of the framing devices that I think would be helpful to understand this is, with a brand, what a brand fundamentally does is it is a way of maintaining a steady supply of novelty. Because when you really think about it, right, branding is essentially a game, right? A game of resource management, with the main resource in question being that sense of novelty or leverage, right? That sense of being new, being original, being something that is worth giving up your own, other various forms of resource, time, attention, and money up to acquire. And when you conceptualize branding, the practice, as this kind of resource management exercise, you can then come to understand that the identification portion of branding, the whole, this is what we give you on an individual basis, this is what we are, this is what we do, this is what you stand to gain if you purchase us or you spend, time or attention on us. Those are the mechanics that are associated with, the game in question, right? The things that you have to work with when it comes to defining what it is or how it performs. Differentiation, on the other hand, is the meta game that surrounds the product and the ways in which individual actors move around one another, right? So, explain this as a game mechanic locked me in. There we go, right? So this is basically the metagame that surrounds branding is the whole differentiation process. Because once someone comes up with a product, naturally there are going to be competitors. And when you have multiple different competitors jousting for the same consumers, what ends up happening is gradually the objective difference in terms of the product that they are offering grows smaller and smaller over time. But as the objective difference shrinks, they look to make the perceived difference in value go up. Because after all, how do you sell your product when someone else is offering basically the same product? And again, I get that we're talking about VTubers and, two different creators are completely different to one another. But when we're talking about corporations, fundamentally what they are all offering, the common thing that they are all offering, is entertainment that is worthy of your time, your attention, and your money. And when it comes to the differences between these corporations, what they are essentially playing off of is, again, that sense of perceived value. It is pretty difficult to quantify, in an objective manner, the difference in quote-unquote value between two different creators. But when you get into the whole process of basing your decision off of perceived value instead, where you look at how those creators are presented to their audiences to make them feel different things, depending on which creator you're talking about, then it becomes a bit easier to understand how these companies end up existing in the same place and, making passes at the same audience in some cases. And so, when it comes to evaluating how a brand functions or what a brand is built off of, these are the two pillars that we would usually use, at least in, media studies, to give a little bit more of an objective dissection as to how the individual components of a brand work together. When it comes to understanding the intentions of a company in defining itself, right, in selling its product, these are the two things that we look at. What does it say it is? What does it say that it does? Versus what does it not do, or at least what does it not do according to it? And how do they try to make themselves look different from, every other company? Now, where this gets interesting is when you're not dealing with just the impression of novelty, but when you're actually in a situation where you are doing something that no one else has done before, right? Or, you can reasonably say that about yourself, that you are attempting something that has not been attempted by someone else before. When you are in a position where you are not only offering the impression of novelty, but again, you are breaking new ground in some way. You're the first to do something, the first to try something. Now, as you can probably imagine, right? Being the first to do something, when it comes to the effect that has on your ability to build a brand for yourself, it really ratchets up your ability to create a solid identification. Because there is no one else around, basically. There's no one else in whatever space you're currently operating in, whatever part of the industry you're currently operating in, that can reasonably dictate to you how you should run your business, how you should operate. Because again, since everything is new, people don't have data with which to be prejudiced against you or prejudiced against the way that you do things, right? So it's pretty self-explanatory as to how breaking new ground, being, again, to use a bit of a tied word, innovative, allows you to boost the identification part of your brand. However, here's the thing. Can anyone spot a possible downside when it comes to differentiating your brand that comes along with being the first to attempt something in an industry or in any sort of competitive space? Need to us, the talent is the value. It's like being a firstborn child. Yeah, that's also a pretty good analogy for this. I watched a VTuber describe the idea of brand color for a talent, and I was fascinated. It was all new to me. Yeah, and again, this is something, a set of theories and thought exercises that has been developed over the course of decades, right, in the field of media studies. But I like it because it gives people words to describe, some of the basic things that you see happening around you, Exactly. Yeah, Daniel. Exactly. The problem is, if you need differentiation in order to build a strong brand, the problem with being the first to do something is that you don't actually have any competitors that offer you an easy example from which to differentiate yourself in front of your audience. If you are the first to do something, every other company has the option of just sitting there and watching how you navigate. And then, based off of those decisions that you end up making, whatever hurdles you stumble into, whatever troubles you have, then shaping their own attempts at differentiation around that. Again, being the first to do something, being a pioneer, does come with a very significant advantage, but it also comes with a drawback that isn't often acknowledged, right? And so, that's not to say, by the way, that, the first to do something is always doomed, right? When it comes to branding, when it comes to building an impression of yourself in the minds of your audience. However, what it does mean is that a company is going to have to be a little bit more active in terms of how it not only attempts to avoid failure while it is operating, in the field, in the niche that it is now carved out for itself, but it continues to react to what other competitors entering that niche end up doing as well, right? The problem is, you cannot be first and also lazy. You cannot be first and also slow to act, because if that is the case, you are going to be very easily overtaken by others who are coming in, who not only have the benefit of observing, what mistakes you've made, what hurdles you've run into, but also others who are coming in with an easy target with which to from which to differentiate themselves in the eyes of your shared, consumer demographic or whatever. And so, again, I referred to before how the dominant force that ends up driving down the amount of novelty or leverage a brand has as competition. But the thing is, the ways in which competition ends up reducing a company or a brand's leverage, reducing a company or a brand's degree of novelty, comes in two overarching forms, right? One is circumstance, i.e., something changes in the surrounding context of your brand and your competitors that is outside of your control. And those changes may disadvantage you or may benefit your competitors. Again, you don't have a say in whether this happens. This just comes out of the ether and surprises you, and you now have to deal with it. The second, though, is strategy. Changes to the brand and or its competitors, policies, methods, or messaging. This is when people make active choices and decisions to try and maneuver around one another, right? When a brand makes a decision to implement a change in how it does business or how it tries to advertise itself in response to something that a rival brand is doing. And there are two very easy examples that we have of this happening, out in the real world that we can very easily observe for ourselves. In the case of circumstance, a very easy case study of how how a change in circumstance can end up influencing how novel a brand gets to be. We can look at, for example, 50 Shades of Grey and how it has aged compared to its, more recent competitors over the years since it's been published. And in the case of looking at how strategy impacts companies' ability to pursue or maintain a degree of novelty in the eyes of their audience in terms of their branding, how they brand themselves, we can look at, for example, the overarching corporate trend of, companies going on social media and trying to be hashtag relatable, right? So starting off with 50 Shades of Grey. When 50 Shades of Grey was first published in 2011, one of the reasons as to why it managed to break into the mainstream in 2015 with the release of its movie, right? So originally it was just a work of smut, right? According to the author, it was originally supposed to be, if I remember correctly, Twilight fan fiction. And yet, this book this smut book was eventually turned into a movie that grossed, millions, billions of dollars worldwide. And one of the reasons behind its success was arguably the fact that it was pretty normie friendly for smut. When you compare it to other different types of smut, right? 50 Shades of Grey is actually pretty vanilla. And at the time that it was published, that was what gave it its success. Its ability to break out into the mainstream, access a wider audience, and become most people's definitive idea as to what, smutty fiction looks like. However, as time went on, since 2015, of the decade that has elapsed since, the surrounding context around 50 Shades of Grey has changed. Society in general, at least in the West, has become a whole lot more accepting of open public discussion and or celebration of kinks of various different degrees, right? And as a result, the thing that helped 50 Shades of Grey break into the mainstream also ended up becoming the thing that has now reduced its overarching relevance in the field of fictional smut. Its vanilla nature, or its relatively vanilla nature. Because nowadays, when you look at what smut fiction consists of, you have things like Baldur's Gate 3 with, the infamous bear sex scene that was used in the earliest trailers or the showreels of what the game would look like. You have things like those books that you just can't escape. You walk into any bookstore, you look to the side, and you'll see, smuts primarily aimed at the female audience, right? The Gentling of the Beast, and of course the infamous Morning Glory Milking Farm. Again, as circumstances surrounding a brand and its competitors change, it may, that adjusts the brand standing, right? And obviously, when it comes to 50 Shades of Grey, it can't really compete with the smut of today anymore in terms of being a standout work of what that genre of fiction encompasses and represents. You start with 50 Shades of Grey and then 10 years later you finish with Morning Glory Milking Farm. No pun intended. But Gunnar games with mild fan service are evil? Yeah. So again, this is an example of what happens when the circumstances around a brand change to make it less desirable. Not because it did anything differently from what it started off doing, but simply because its competition were put in a better position to appeal to an audience that has now changed in their tastes, their inclinations, and possibly, I'm dread to say, their needs. Conversely, you have the way in which changes of strategy can create a loss of novelty in a brand. Now, in the early 2010s, when, companies were first finding their footing on social media and on the internet, generally speaking, they were pretty bad at it. They were pretty bad at utilizing social media, the laws of virality, the ways in which people engage with one another online in a manner that would help them promote themselves. However, there were two companies that ended up pioneering ways of using social media that fundamentally changed the game going forwards for how corpos would engage with their audiences or would attempt to engage with their audiences via those mediums. Denny's, when they made their Tumblr, which is basically just no different from your average Tumblr page, right? It was full of like photos, memes, all of those things that an average everyday person, well, I suppose if you're using Tumblr, you might not be average every day, but an average everyday Tumblr user would end up posting, right? They essentially blended in to the user base that they were trying to appeal to. And then you had Wendy's, who utilized the whole more informal, colloquial way in which people communicated with one another on social media to pioneer the whole process of essentially ditching the idea of professional communication from a brand account, right? This is where they would, your mom, there's no message less corporatized than your mom is a hoe tweeted out from a corporate account, right? And over time, what these two companies ended up solidifying in the eyes of other companies, because initially when they did this, this was wildly popular at the time because for most of their online audience, they'd never seen this before. They had never seen a corporation completely drop the professionalism and just go all out on, calling out one another, posting memes, basically acting in the same manner as a normal human user just trying to vibe, right? Yeah, posting this on main that never been heard of before. And so audiences reacted really positively to this. And when they saw audiences reacting positively to this, other companies began to ape the exact same methods of communication exhibited by Denny's and exhibited by Wendy's, to the point where now, a decade and a bit later, it has become the norm for most companies to have some social media intern basically tweeting for them as just some quirky random guy, right? You can see Opera GX is like the archetypical version, the archetypical example as to what this looks like. Admittedly, when they did the Pride Month thing, it was kind of funny, but they have become infamous for how much corporate reply guying they undertake as a brand using their social media pages. And then, of course, you have things like these consumer interactions that these social media interns engage in for the sake of drumming up publicity, such as that case where the Wingstop Twitter account started flirting with a random commenter in the replies to one of their tweets. So, for example, this user called K Cookie says, "God, I need you in me," presumably in reply to some sort of offer that Wingstop was having at the time. To which Wingstop replies, using their official account, mind you, "All you have to do is open your mouth." And again, this is the norm nowadays. When you look at this isn't even unique to, food or internet browsers. I think, funnily enough, I think ChromaShift itself, as a company, has been engaging in this sort of social media marketing strategy where whoever's in charge of their account just goes reply guying on the people's tweets. But again, this has gone from being an exception to being the meta, to being the norm. And as these companies change their strategies in order to emulate the success of their forebears, to innovate the success of the more innovative among them, this loses relatively quickly as well any novelty or appeal through novelty that it might have had with the audience. And again, if you are the first to do something, this is something you're going to have to take into account. This is something that you are going to have to adapt to. Otherwise, you are going to very quickly lose your relevance without even doing anything to quote-unquote warrant or deserve it. And so, when you're confronted with these two, the dual threats that competition presents to your company, to your brand, specifically to the distinctiveness of your brand, you then get to the question of, okay, how do I overcome this? How do I future-proof myself, my brand, my company, my identity in the eyes of my consumers, viewers, whatever? How do I protect my place in their life, essentially? Because that is what's under threat when competition moves in. And the answer is... I hate how much this word has been corrupted by the internet. Innovation, right? Innovation is the solution to both of the problems that are presented with an increase in competition over time, in a space in the industry or whatever. And when it comes to innovation, right, unfortunately, it's one of those words that has kind of been overused to the point of meaninglessness, mostly by tech bros, crypto bros, and finance bros, or as I would like to refer to them, San Fran subhumans, right? Unfortunately, it has had the effect of completely eliminating most people's ability to conceptualize what innovation actually consists of. And the fundamental hurdle in terms of understanding that I usually have to try and jump over when trying to convey how innovation is relevant to this whole keeping competitive, what it actually means to someone who isn't poisoned by San Fran speak, is that most people, when they think of innovation as a concept, they tend to think about, they tend to picture, something that is a game changer, something that completely changes the nature of how something operates or looks, right? Something that is totally different, completely radical, something that, again, has never been done or seen before, right? Essentially, all of these conceptualizations of what the term innovation even means are all based off of that hyperbolic, salesperson in a conference room thing that finance bros, tech bros, CEOs, whatever, tend to do in their pitches. However, when I'm trying to get you guys to understand what I mean by innovation, it doesn't have to be anything big or flashy. It can just be a minor adjustment to how you communicate, to how you present yourself as a brand that clarifies, again, what you are and what you are not. And again, when I say simple, insignificant, and small, I do mean small, possibly small, minor, insignificant. And to give you an example as to what I mean by an example of innovation that can significantly boost the value, the integrity of a brand, I'm going to default to something that Tsunderia themselves actually did relatively early on into the company's existence, right? And hopefully this also serves us a dual purpose to prove that innovation wasn't impossible for Tsunderia. It just required a bit of effort that evidently that the executives evidently fell out of love with towards the end of the company. But to give you an example of when Tsunderia actually did do something innovative when it comes to their own brand. As you may recall, in June of 2020, when Tsunderia first announced its presence to the world, right, when it first debuted as a company, there were two logos that it was sort of tossing up and deciding between. Many of you know Tsunderia based off of, the pink and blue crown that they end up going with later, but that's not how they started off with. The first two logos that they tossed up for their audience to decide on was a choice between a four-pointed star encased in a circle and a crescent moon. Now, on the 24th of June, they would end up making this post on their Twitter. Hi, everyone. Thank you for your continued support of Kamiko Kana. Happy birthday, Kana. To kick off our reveal, we invite everyone to voice their opinion on which logo you would prefer for Tsunderia. Poll in thread. And then they put up a poll that would decide between these two logos. And ultimately, the bottom logo won. This is the logo that you will see in the bottom corners or top corners of the talent streams when you go back to around June or July of 2020. So, the crescent moon logo. The problem? Using a crescent moon shape or using just a general crescent shape as part of your logo in a VTuber company is only a few steps below being the visual equivalent of calling your company the something. Like, I say that and you instantly know what I'm talking about, right? We've seen a whole bunch of them in this industry. V-Chiban, V-Shoujo, VC, V-Fleet, V-Reverie, V-Tarded. It's all the same thing, right? And again, the thing is, when you look at that, the crescent moon shape as, part of a company's logo, right? As part of Tsunderia's logo, this would, as predicted, age incredibly poorly. Because even as soon as July of 2020, another VTuber company, also based in the West, CyberLive, would end up debuting with a company logo that also revolved around having that, that crescent shape, albeit, in the form of a kind of YouTube play symbol rather than a moon, as the defining feature of their logo, right? Then fast forward to the next year, and you have two companies that end up using the crescent moon shape, but just flipped around with a little bit of added noise in the middle as well. The first being Amberglow, which debuted in June of 2021. This was, again, a US-based agency that started off doing things like webcomics, but later on tried to branch out into becoming a VTuber agency as well. They debuted their first set of 4 talents in June of 2021, and this is what their logo looked like. And then, at the end of the year, an almost exact replica when it comes to the way that this logo looks, you have Aurora Live VR. Now, Aurora Live VR as a company did exist before this point, but this is when they debuted their first VTuber, and when they first started calling themselves a VTuber agency. And again, when you look at these 4 logos, this is a nightmare when it comes to trying to distinguish yourself or differentiate yourself between each individual one. And so, if Tsunderia had just stuck with this, good luck competing in terms of distinctiveness with all of these other agencies. And that's without even getting into what the fuck does the moon have to do with the whole Tsundere/kingdom thing that they had going on by calling themselves Tsunderia, right? However, they would end up essentially sidestepping this problem on August 5th of 2020, when they would put out a tweet saying, "Hi everyone, as you may have noticed, we have updated our logo. What do you think about it?" And by this time, they had now changed their logo within, the first 2 months of existing as a company, from that pink crescent moon, to now the logo that all of us associate with Tsunderia, that all of us remember Tsunderia by, which is the pink and blue crown. And again, this logo was, in my opinion, whoever made this redesign, 100% hands down, best visual retouch in the industry, purely because of how much of a difference is created between this and this. Like, if you break it down, right, you have the pinks associated with femininity. You have the cold, the blue, the pale blue that's associated with the whole cold. Again, perfect encapsulation using just color, right, of the whole idea of a tsundere, cold, cold girl, cold woman, whatever. And then, of course, you have the shape of the logo arranged in a crown, which reflects the whole fact that they named this company Tsunderia in order to make it sound like the name of a kingdom. So again, both visually in terms of the shape that it occupies, as well as the colors that are now being used, it is pretty much perfect as a logo. The only way in which this logo could be improved even more, at least in my opinion, is if the the coloring on the text was reversed as well. So like the sun being the blue and the Daria being the pink. But again, that's like a minor gripe. But again, like I said, this is a vast improvement over this, specifically because, one, it completely encapsulates what Tsunderia is about in terms of its premise, the main idea behind the name, the brand, but also because of how different it is from all of the other agencies and their logos. Because you have a lot of agencies that are going to end up using some sort of moon or crescent shape, not just because it looks, like the moon, which is a very common symbol that is used in Asian culture and therefore would also be adopted by Asian corporations, Asian-based corporations, but also because it looks like a play button, which again is going to be used by a lot of corporations that operate in the content creation industry. So the moving away from that, huge innovation when it comes to making the brand different from its competitors. And again, when I talk about differentiation, when I talk about innovation, this is what I mean. It's not some sort of, it's not some major redesign where you pay millions of dollars and then turn your logo into a parody of itself, which is what we now associate with rebrands, redos of logos, etc., among corporations, right? That's for some reason that seems to be what most people in the the corporate in corporate discourse seem to conceptualize when they think of innovation. But when I talk about innovation, it's something as simple as this, right? It's something as basic of a change as this. And so when you are looking at innovation, this is how you keep your brand competitive. This is how you ward off the dual threats of changing circumstances and changing strategies among competitors. And the thing is, I point out this little innovation as an example of, something that Tsunderia was capable of doing. Because Tsunderia, as the very first EN-based agency, they needed to be able to innovate in order to survive, because they were very much at the mercy of both of these threats. 2020 alone was, because of lockdowns, the year where, as a result of more and more people being stuck in their homes and watching VTubers, you were also naturally going to get a whole bunch of companies that were cramming to get into this little niche, this content niche that was only just becoming popular in mainstream, at least in the West. It had already been mainstream in the East, but again, this was new ground and kind of a commercial free for all. And again, second thing being strategy, because when you are the first to do something, you do not have the luxury of starting off with someone whose mistakes someone or something whose mistakes you can learn from, right? Tsunderia, in being the first, also ended up learning its lessons face first. And again, when it comes to both of these, to give you an idea as to how both of these threats ended up manifesting around Tsunderia, right? This is what Tsunderia, the debut of Tsunderia's first gen, English-speaking gen, looks like when you compare it to the debut dates of the big three, former big three, on a timeline of just 2020 and 2021, right? And again, I'm not narrowing it down to EN-based agency because, let's be realistic, no one cares if you are based in the EN or if you're based in Japan. At the end of the day, you are still aiming for the same audience, English-speaking viewers. And in that regard, if you release a gen of English-speaking talents, you are not just going to be competing with people who are based in the same country as you. You're going to be competing with companies that are based overseas, but trying to reach for the same audience. And so, this is what Tsunderia looks like on that timeline, where it's only just the big three when it comes to when they released their first EN speaking gen. This is what that timeline looks like when we include every other company that emerged around this time with an English-speaking gen targeting English-speaking audiences. And mind you, this isn't all of them. These are just the ones that I personally remember or I have personally heard of. In the same month that Tsunderia was announced by Kana, two other agencies, My Hollow TV and now defunct Deep Sea Productions, which was a Philippine-based agency that one of their talents, I believe, named Lilith, had one collab with Hoshino Charlotte 1 week before the company imploded. But yeah, so in the same month, you had two other small companies debuting their gens, their EN-speaking gens as well. Now, granted, with My Hollow TV, it was just one talent, but again, same thing, right? Then, very next month, as I pointed out before, you had CyberLive debuting their first gen of EN-speaking talent. Then, between January and July of 2021, this is nightmare mode when it comes to the addition of new competitors you're going to have to start thinking about as a company. Right, you have Prism Project in January, V Reverie in February, Kawaii in March. You have a break in April. Then you have Niji Sanji EN and Heavenrend, which was a 4-person VTuber company, VTuber agency, in May. And then in June, you have, of course, FaZe Connect and Amberglow. This averages out to just over one new corpo a month. Now, on top of that, I'm also ignoring the influx of indies that entered the industry between 2020 and 2021. When you put all of those things together, you have a lot to compete with as a company when it comes to making your talents, making yourself stand out, to grab an audience's attention. Because, again, when you have this much in terms of options as, a viewer, as a member of the VTubing audience, that vague entity, this is something that is guaranteed to provide at least a little bit of choice paralysis if you are specifically looking for, an English-speaking VTuber. Even if you are committed to only consuming content from corporations, this is still a dizzying amount of choice that you have to contend with as a viewer, as a member of the audience, as a possible consumer, whatever, right? Because again, since these are corporations debuting their first gens, most of these gens are between 3 to 5 talents. FaZe is a bit of an outlier because Gen 1 consisted of 7 talents. But again, these aren't just one people at a time. These are multiple people all being thrown out into the industry at once for audiences to consume and decide between. So when you look at where Tsunderia lands on this timeline, immediately you can see how circumstances around it were changing rapidly. Yes, they were the first, but they were by no means unique, and they would not stay unique. As time went on, they became less and less unique, and they would become less and less unique unless they tried to change something when it comes to their brand, when it comes to the way that they stand out. Because again, when circumstances make it so that you have more and more competitors over time, naturally you're going to have to do something in order to make yourself continue to stand out from those competitors, right? This is where it is important for your executives as a company to have a coherent vision for what you want to be. You needed essentially, right? You needed the same degree of understanding and creativity that went into the Tsunderia logo rebrand, but applied on a much wider scale across the company and it's the way that it operated. Because this is the kind of thing that would compel any sort of, seller of a good, producer of a good, to start changing the way that they present themselves, to adapt to this new influx of competition. And so that brings us back then to the question of if Tsunderia needed to innovate their brand in order to stand out, in order to understand, what they needed to do in terms of adjusting their brand, etc., what the company needed to do to adjust its brand, what its executives needed to do in order to pivot to accommodate all of this new competition, right? We need to start off by first considering what was Tsunderia's brand in the first place, right? How did Tsunderia define itself? And to this end, we have a very convenient resource that was put out by the company itself. On August 27th, 2020, Hoshino Charlotte would end up hosting a Reddit AMA alongside S-Train, one of the members of staff that was previously identified in her debut stream as, at the time, head mod and head administrator. And so, some of the questions that were asked in this stream and some of the answers that were provided give us a pretty good idea as to some of the defining features that Tsunderia defaulted to, at least at the beginning, in order to differentiate themselves from the VTuber companies that preceded it, and presumably the VTuber companies that would end up joining the fray later on as well. Starting off, at around 7 minutes 42 seconds, a user by the name of Blue Tomato 10836 asks, "What is Tsunderia, and can others join?" Now, to answer the first part of the question, S-Train responds saying, "Tsunderia is a VTuber agency that is in the same style as other agencies like Hololive, Niji-Sanji, and Voms, but is based in the US and focused mainly on English-speaking streams." So again, most of these questions in the first half of this section of the stream are based primarily around asking Tsunderia to define what they are. So this is the identification part of the Tsunderia brand, right? When you define what you are, what you do, etc., etc. So at 9 minutes 37 seconds, another question asked by a user called Azior says, "Where did the name Tsunderia come from?" And then PPP replies in chat saying, "The painful truth is that it's exactly what you'd think. It's a play on tsundere, and the Ia part was chosen to make it sound kingdomy." Right? So again, this is why, with this being, the lore behind the name Tsunderia, the rebrand of the logo, the redesign of the logo, makes perfect sense, right? As to why it functioned the way it was, why it was done the way that it was, etc., etc. But again, so at this point in time, when we asked the question, what was Tsunderia? What did it identify itself as? These were some of the initial answers that we got, right? A VTuber agency that is similar in style in terms of, how it arranges itself to agencies like Hololive. Presumably, they would be doing gens, they would have debuts, they would have auditions, etc., etc., etc. They would operate off of a payment split, but mainly focused on English-speaking audiences. And again, at the time, that was a flex, because this is not something that existed in the EN side of the industry yet. Then, at 25 minutes 6 seconds, you have a question by Wonderful Lime 2768 asking, what is Tsunderia hoping to achieve for the future? And again, this is another question that ties into the what do you do part of establishing a brand. To which S-Train replies saying, what we would like, sort of in broad strokes, is we'd like to have some more varied personalities. We want to have different types of people represented, essentially. Like more nations represented, because right now it's just America and the Philippines. So having more nations represented would be a cool thing too. And more music. We want music. We've made some pretty great contacts in the music industry already. So we're probably going to start moving in that direction pretty soon. So based off this, we've been able to glean just a little bit more as to how Tsunderia defines itself as an agency. What does it provide? What does it do? Well, it wants to provide representation for English-speaking VTubers, and they also want to specialize in music. They want to go down the path of specializing in music at some point in the future. Right? Then, at 30 minutes 47 seconds, a user by the name of Sanamoe Alex asks, what was the original goal of Tsunderia regarding the VTuber market, and what are your current objectives? PPP responds in chat saying, our original goal of Tsunderia was to develop EN VTubers at a quality comparable to what you would see in the East. At the time of Tsunderia's conception, the English VTuber community was still in its infancy, and we noticed a gap in the market that we wanted to fill with high-quality production. A lot has changed now, but we're still focusing on delivering high-quality entertainment to our audience. We want to help develop this community by making English VTubers more accessible to the masses and offering independents things they might not have been able to achieve on their own. So at this particular point in time, they've added 2 more points, the whole what do we do, what do we provide aspect of their brand, right? They want to provide to their audience consistent, high quality content, and they want to provide to the VTubers that they may recruit or who may be looking to be recruited by them a sense of, a degree of empowerment, right? The ability to have more resources and support at your disposal so that you can do things, presumably embark on projects that you would never have been able to accomplish if you were just an indie on your own. Then, starting from 38 minutes 35 seconds, the questions start to pivot towards more of what makes you different from all of the rest, right? What makes you different from what came before you, which were all of the companies, all of the VTuber agencies and companies that existed in the East before Tsunderia became a thing. So this question by Coroner Kid and Toxinator Bob. Does Tsunderia function like Hololive and Nijisanji? Is Tsunderia more of an idol company or just a VTuber company? To which S-Train replies saying, in structure, we are going to be very similar to those other groups, but I don't really think we would expect idol culture around the streamers, even when we do get into the music production aspect, because we really like the high community interaction. And then Charlotte saying, I think for idol culture, you can't interact with your audience as much. So this is where we start getting into how this brand, this company, differentiates itself from its Eastern competitors. Which is, we're not going to do the whole idol culture thing. We're going to do music, but not the idol culture thing. This was, again, key differentiator between Tsunderia and Hololive, Nijisanji, etc. Then, 43 minutes 15 seconds, a question by a user called Academic Slave asks explicitly, what sets Tsunderia apart from other VTuber companies? And again, I've talked about this on stream before, but the reply that S-Train gives may give some people a sense of deja vu. Quote, We put a lot of focus on the communities that we've built around each streamer, primarily the Discord servers, and you can ask anyone in those servers, they'll tell you these communities are very different from similarly sized servers, even for other VTubers, as well as the ability to interact with the streamer off-stream. I've heard that's a fairly rare thing. There's another sort of discrete but important difference, is that streamers do have a lot of freedom, not just in the servers, but sort of with their brand, their identity, because they work with their model's illustrator to get it perfect for them. The streams that they do are the games that they want, or the topics that they want, as long as they don't violate the TOS. The schedules are flexible. I've personally worked with all the streamers to get their schedules in a sort of way that they don't contradict with one another, because we don't have really tight control over the content because that sort of stress would really come out in the streams. I think people would notice, and we'd like to avoid that. So, one of the things that differentiated them from from their competitors was, talent freedom. And this was August 27th of 2020. Mind you, way before any other company would try to adopt this talking point. Oh shit, Parion, welcome to the stream. Oh boy, them Discord sure did turn out great for them. Again, I'll touch on this in a second, but even as a selling point, that one was always doomed from the start. Then you go on to a quick rewind back to 24 minutes, 49 seconds. A question asked by user Walking Places says, when Kana debuted, was Tsunderia something that was planned all along, or did it come into being later? To which S-Train replies, there was no Kamiko Kana before Tsunderia. PPP wanted to start a VTuber agency, so he asked Kana if she wanted to be a VTuber in his venture. She agreed. That's the TLDR of it, basically. Now, two things. First, if we're just talking legality, that does not hold up, because Tsunderia was only registered as a corporate entity on the 27th of April, and Kana debuted on the 4th. However, what S-Train is getting at, what is implied with this answer, is that Tsunderia as a concept existed predating Kana's debut, and Kana's existence as a VTuber, which means that when she debuted, there was already a group of people around her who presumably were prepared to turn that into a more corporatized thing. And this is an implication that the audience did end up picking up on, because fast forward later on in the stream to 1 hour, 5 minutes, 39 seconds, a user by the name of Mechomancer asks, why did you allow Kamiko Kana to hide the fact that she was a corporate VTuber and allowed her to accept donations to get her Switch and capture card? Shouldn't that have been provided by Tsunderia? Now, probably the answer that they should have given was, well, technically we didn't exist as a company at around that point. We were just a bunch of people trying to help a friend, get their start as a streamer. But that's not quite what S-Train ended up saying. Because in response to this question, S-Train would end up going on this entire tangent saying, when Kana debuted, really the company was just her and PPP. Because Char was a lot of things. By which he means she had an injury that prevented her from making her VTuber debut. At the time, they weren't sure if they were going to be able to launch anyone else, in large part due to your, meaning Char's, injury. At the time, just behind the scenes, it was just PPP. Kana still considered herself to be an independent. Sorry, give me a second. At the time, behind the scenes, it was just PPP. Kana still considered herself to be an independent, as opposed to being part of a company of one. In hindsight, the logic seems kinda off, but they really didn't know if there would be any level of success. Now, what's interesting, and where this starts to tie into the whole differentiation part of the branding process, is what he ends up saying after this. If anyone feels betrayed by the way that the company was revealed, or by any sort of perceived misrepresentation, we're really sorry about that. That was never our intention to deceive or misrepresent ourselves, and one of my main goals with Tsunderia is to increase the level of communication and transparency within the company. That's something that's very important to me as well. I want to make sure that everyone who's watching knows that we're completely legit. The only thing we want to do is make good content, and that all the streamers are being taken care of, because, like, if we're getting taken advantage of, we end up going under. And if the streamers get taken advantage of, then we don't have any streamers in our company, which means we have no revenue. So it doesn't make any sense, and honestly, having Char as part of the company is perfect, because she is both streamer and staff. So if any one side is getting screwed, then Char is going to know about it, because she's going to be getting screwed along with them. Now, as you can probably tell, all of this is foreshadowing for the fact that S-Train was not exactly the most competent communicator in the company. Because if this is something he's saying as a way of promoting the company, boy oh boy, are we going to have problems going into the future of the company. But, few things to just sort of pick apart there with that response. First of all, yes, the whole transparency thing was something that was seemingly, at least in the Western corposphere, started with Tsunderia, right? That was one of the things that they said they wanted to pursue, and that was arguably one of the things that differentiated them from their Eastern competitors, which is this whole focus on, at least on the surface, trying to give their audience the best idea possible, the most clear picture possible of what things were happening behind the scenes, giving them a peek at how the sausage was made, a look behind the curtain, etc., etc. However, the second little thing here that is pretty novel, even if, it has now proven itself to be novel in a bad way. Like, every time when you look at something that isn't often done by corporations, people have a tendency to mistake not often adopted as, secret OP, when that's not actually how it works. Most of the time, in most corporate spaces, people don't do things because they don't work, not the other way around. Now, the reason why I bring that up is because when S-Train says kind of offhandedly, having Char as part of the company is perfect because she's both streamer and staff. So if one side is getting screwed, then Char is going to know about it because she's going to be getting screwed along with them. It is telling that is presented as a positive thing, because as precedent has now proven, with the benefit of hindsight, we can make the observation that that's not actually a good thing. Because when you have a talent that doubles as part of management, it doesn't actually increase their agency in any kind of way. Because as management, if their executives, the people above them who pay them, are incompetent, they don't have any more agency than a talent does. They just have double the stress, because they have to answer the other talents, who are now confused and stressed as to what's going on as well. So it's double the responsibility, with only a marginal increase in agency. And even that marginal increase is based upon the competence of your superiors, which is, at least in the realm of VTubing, statistically speaking, quite a big ask. So, this already touched on one of the things that made Tsunderia novel, but was also one of the biggest flaws associated with the company. At least something that would show itself with time to be one of the biggest flaws in how the company was operating. But to touch on the whole idea of strategies and the lack of novelty or originality, one of the reasons as to why metas often end up emerging when it comes to how corporations decide to go about selling their product, producing their product, etc., etc., is because while there are, at least theoretically, an infinite number of ways in which a company can choose to operate, there are only a finite amount of ways that are optimal for operation. And when it comes to those optimal methods, generally speaking, over time, as an industry becomes more consolidated, better explored, better understood, companies tend to gravitate towards the same optimal methods. Now, that doesn't mean that that's always going to be the way that things are, right? That doesn't, just because it's the norm in an industry to do something a certain way, doesn't mean that there isn't any such optimal method that hasn't already been exposed, right? There could very well be out there. But trying to find optimal strategies requires taking on additional risk. And generally speaking, companies that are focused on making money, that are are already in a position where they are making a good amount of money, they are not going to be incentivized to take that risk. And so, generally speaking, when you notice that a company is doing something new, innovative, out of the ordinary, yes, it could be a great thing for that company in the sense that they might end up becoming a pioneer in their industry, in their space. But conversely, it can also be a sign that they have very little left to lose. And that's going to become quite pertinent when we get into the later portions of Tsunderia's history. But for now, coming back to the main question that we started off the segment with, what was Tsunderia's brand? How did Tsunderia define itself as a brand? We now have all the material we need to form at least a cursory impression as to what the executive's answer to that question is. When we look at, what they identified as versus how they try to differentiate themselves from their competitors, under the category of identification, right? What they are, what they do. Some of the things that they noted down as things that defined, that part of their brand were increasing representation in VTubing. That was, a very explicit goal that they had as the very first Ian Corpo. Making music, specializing in music and music production, presumably. High quality and consistent content in entertainment, right? Offline interactivity with creators, and finally, transparency. Those were the positive, by which I don't mean, morally good, but more so just additive qualities that Tsunderia ended up. Sorry, give me a second. Oh, goodness. Okay. So, these were the positive qualities that Tsunderia attributed to themselves when it comes to building and structuring their brand. When you get to the differentiation portion, though, these were the things that they said they were not, the things that they emphasized in order to distance themselves from their competitors, or at least their predecessors in the East. They were not a proponent of idol culture. They were in favor of giving their talents freedom. Now, again, even though this point is phrased in a positive manner, the reason why I put it in differentiation is because in reality, when you actually look at what, quote unquote, talent freedom looks like in practice, it is more of a negative thing than a positive thing. Not in the sense that it is necessarily bad, but in the sense that it takes away, it is the absence of rather than an addition to. And freedom is essentially absence of structure. Whether that structure takes place, and that structure could very well be absence of support just as much as it is absence of restriction. And when you talk about talent freedom, that is fundamentally what you are saying, even if it's dressed in a more positive manner. You are essentially saying that you don't give your talents a lot of structure. And then finally, the last point that they gave in order to differentiate themselves was a lack of total talent staff separation. They had one of their debut talents who was also outwardly and, advertised as, promoted as a part-time member of management. Oh, Flake Emon, welcome to the stream. So, when you put all of these things together, right, you have this idea that if you have a talent who's also part of management, that's going to make things better because they understand things from both perspectives and they're going to be doubly incentivized to make sure it works from both ends. Again, with the benefit of hindsight, we can now say for certain that's not how it works in practice. But at the time, this was how Tsunderia defined itself. This was, these were the aspects of their operation as a business, their identity as a business, that they chose to put out there in the eye of the public to define themselves as being different from the rest, of justifying your investment in terms of your time, your attention, your money in them and their talents specifically. The only problem, as we pointed out before, this was a source of novelty that had an expiry date. And those arguably two expiry dates, one of them being November of 2020 and the second being June of 2022. And why those months in particular? Because those were the months in which another company would muscle in on the scene and essentially use the exact same talking points to define their own brand. That company in question? VShojo. In November of 2020, that's when they started. And right out of the gate, they started talking about how they wanted to increase representation in E and VTubing. They want to ensure high quality and consistency in entertainment, empower creators to create things they weren't able to do as indies, and that they were valuing, they would adopt a talent-first approach towards creating, making content, right? All that transparency and all. And in addition to that, VShojo was also a competitor to Tsunderia in terms of trying to hijack essentially those talking points about things that differentiated them from their Eastern counterparts, because VShojo was founded by a resentful tech bro Filipino that had a hate boner for Hololive and Niji-Sanji, which meant that the things that they would hop on about in order to differentiate themselves from those two companies was how, they are not proponents of idol culture. They reject even idol culture. They give their talent freedom. Now, again, they did allude to this a little bit in November of 2020, but then they dialed that up exponentially in June of 2022 when they acquired Nazuna and Kason as part of their JP roster. And that was when they really started doubling down on the whole we are the anti-Hololive, we are the anti-Niji-Sanji type thing that they were doing right up until they cocked it later on. And then finally, the lack of total talent staff separation by virtue of the fact that, well, when you look at the way that VShojo operated, they didn't have a PR department. They just had their talents talking on social media. So again, the reason as to why I present this as something that Tsunderia needed to overcome, something that presented a deadline for Tsunderia to innovate on their brand, was because, technically speaking, they were targeting different audiences, right? Yes, Tsunderia's talents, quite a number of them at this point especially, did stream on Twitch as well. But for the most part, especially later on, they were mostly catering to a YouTube-based audience. VShojo was exclusively Twitch-based. Right, so for that reason, you could maybe make the argument that, yeah, they were kind of directed at different people. But when we're talking cultural relevance, when we're talking things that people remember you by, when I say the Talent Freedom Agency, people think of VShojo. They don't think about Tsunderia, even though Tsunderia was the first to do this, was the first to try and use that as a defining selling point when it comes to shaping their brand and corporate identity. And again, that exemplifies what I mean. When you have an overlapping brand with another company, if you don't find some way of essentially crawling out of the shadow that they end up imposing on you as a company, as a brand, you are going to be stuck perpetually in that shadow. And when it comes to the ways in which Tsunderia marketed itself early on, a lot of those same talking points were, like I said before, hijacked by VShojo. By virtue purely of the fact that VShojo had, relative to the platform that they primarily streamed on, closer connections to the people in charge. They had a larger, in terms of pure numbers, they had a larger debut roster of talents, and they also had significantly more money to throw around after 2022. Right, because they received an 11 million USD injection from a whole bunch of venture capital companies. Now, we can only speculate as to what Tsunderia could have done with $11 million, but I would argue that the outcome would probably be similar to what VShojo ended up doing with it, which is, a whole lot of waste and a fat lot of nothing. But, again, the point remains that if Tsunderia did not innovate on their brand, when they were presented with a competitor that was going to muscle in on those same talking points in the same manner as VShojo, because they were not the first to say it, but they were the loudest to say it. You are presented with a situation in which, according to these two deadlines, they needed to find some way of doubling down on the parts of that brand that are not being hijacked, that are not at risk of being overtaken by a louder competitor. And they still had two things left as part of those original aspects that were initially presented during this AMA as being defining traits of what they are. Right? The whole focus on music, which VShojo never ended up doing, even though they had like phases where they said they were going to do a concert. They did one and then they gave up. Then they had the second thing, of course, then being offline interactivity with creators. Now, realistically, that scenario that I presented where they had 2 points left over was a little bit of a lie, because in reality, they only had one, which was music. The reason why offline interactivity with creators was never really an option when it came to something that the company could use to differentiate itself from its competitors was because offline interactivity as a selling point is contingent upon absence of success as a content creator. Now, what I mean by that is the larger your audience grows, the more difficult it is going to be, completely outside of your control, right? You can't do anything about this. This is not a VTuber specific thing. This is a content creation in general thing. The larger your audience grows, the more difficult it is to ensure some degree of online interactivity with your audience. The more difficult it becomes to do that in a secure manner as well, because obviously the larger your audience grows, the more schizos are going to become part of it, right? The more bad actors are going to end up infiltrating it. So what that means, though, is success as a content creator means number go up. Forget being a content creator, though, because success as a company relies on number go up. So what that means is this is a selling point that essentially is designed to make itself redundant over time. Because if you are successful as a company, you will eventually, quite naturally, lose this as a plausible benefit that you can provide to your audience. If you become a large enough company, the risks of allowing your talent to simply, to willy-nilly, the risk of promising to your audience, essentially, that they will have offline access to your talents goes up exponentially. The larger you become in terms of your fan base, the more successful you become as a company. So realistically speaking, this is a selling point that would only ever work so long as Tsunderia remains small. And when you are a company, that's not really something you want to lock yourself into. You don't want to lock yourself into a trait that only functions so long as you don't have, a certain degree of profitability or growth. Because yes, not everything about a company has to be about growth, least of all something that's in entertainment. But it is naive to ignore that does have to be some of the goals that your company has, at least over time. Because a company that does not grow is a company that is going to die, right? And again, this is a selling point that becomes less and less functional the more you grow. So again, realistically, this wasn't really an option. So all that Tsunderia had left, in terms of at least the initial set of sales pitches that they delivered to the public, was the whole doubling down on music thing. PPP could have bought so many Yu-Gi-Oh packs with 11 million. I assume that the whole Yu-Gi-Oh pack meme was something that originated from the Sun discords, because I was looking through what people were saying in like forums and stuff, but I only ever saw people talking about seeing that, like streams where PPP would supposedly do, where he would just open up Yu-Gi-Oh packs in front of his talents or whatever. But I never saw like a first-hand, like a screenshot or recording of anything like that taking place. I'll take your word for it that was something that happened. But it is a thing that comes up very often whenever I'm looking through and reading through people, talking about how Tsunderia was run. The whole PvP's Yu-Gi-Oh obsession thing is a very funny recurrent theme, although morbidly funny in hindsight. So, one other thing though. Despite the fact that, at least by looking at this, you would assume that they don't really have a lot of things that they could double down on in order to turn them into a, double down and innovate on, in order to turn themselves, pivot their brand into something that is probably more distinct from what their competitors were saying or doing. There was, however, one thing that came up during this AMA that was not presented as a possible differentiation, a possible point of differentiation or a possible selling point, but would end up becoming one. And that happened at 2 hours, 39 minutes, and 25 seconds, when a user by the name of Domo Agari Thanks asks, quote, "What are some of the biggest challenges in cultivating an audience? How competitive is the space?" To which S-Train would end up replying, saying, "The biggest challenge is being seen by the most amount of people as possible, honestly. That, I knew going in, was going to be the biggest obstacle to potential growth." That's not the important part, though. The important part is what he says after this. It's not really competition, because you're not competing with other streamers, unless they're in the same time slot as you. But even then, there are VODs, so you still get those views later on. So calling it competitive is really misrepresenting the reality of the situation, because we're all in the same industry, we all have something to gain by working together. And this philosophy towards other, this perspective towards other content creators, or potentially even their agencies in the same space, this was something that truly separated Tsunderia, at least in the early stages of the EN industry's development, from the competitors that were moving in from the outside. Because this is a degree of, almost noble idealism that was very much at odds with the cynical nature of an industry in the process of birthing itself, right? And given time, as we will touch on in part 2 of this topic, this is something that would end up becoming a distinctive part of Tsunderia's identity as a company, a part of its brand that would truly differentiate itself from the likes of VShoujo or HoloLive or Niji-Sanji. But, as I will talk about in more detail later on, this is not something that can truly be relied upon in order to differentiate yourself from your competitors. Because if you want to prove that you view other companies, other talents, as allies in the same struggle to creating good content, what that means is, just as you get a boon to your brand reputation for being non-competitive in your philosophy, in the way that you do business, you are also going to grant that exact same boon to the brands of your collaborators. Not competitors, because that's not how this is framed. But nonetheless, if you gain that benefit to your brand, they are also gaining the same benefit to their brand. So yes, this is a differentiating factor, but it is one that is inherently shared across multiple agencies / multiple companies with their collaborations amongst one another. So yes, it is distinctive, but it will not take you very far in the journey to become unique, so to speak. And so we've kind of summed up, at this point at least in Tsunderia's development, the different options that they had when it came to defining their own brand, right? Building what the company would be known for. When you look at the way that the company was conceptualized in a top-down manner, right? What the executives, the founding members of the company, what they envisioned for what made Tsunderia unique, distinctive, worthy of their audience's time, attention, and money. These are the points that were presented, at least during this AMA. Right? At this stage, we could make the conclusion with this primary source that this is what they were thinking of. However, one of the other things that, again, we have the benefit of hindsight to be able to observe in this AMA was when we look at some of the answers that were provided, there were a hell of a lot of red flags as to how certain people who were running this company, straight, did not seem very suited to their role in the company. And we could start off with a question that was asked at 55 minutes 11 seconds by a user called Ikatskin, who asks, "Do any of you have any experience starting a company, or is this your first venture? Did you seek outside assistance from others more experienced?" Now, usually it would be a little disconcerting if someone just straight up said, nah, I don't really have much experience, but I'm doing my best. But what's infinitely more disturbing in hindsight is when someone basically does say that, but presents it as a good thing. And on that note, S-Train's reply to this question was, quote, I've personally worked in on a lot of different industries in various capacities. But this is pretty much my first time in a managerial role. I've done like coaching for baseball before, which I guess is kind of a managerial role, but I mean, they were kids, so probably not. But I never really wanted to be in a management position before. I was always pretty content not being like the absolute lowest rung, but maybe like 1 or 2 rungs above that. I don't know. My father was a business owner. I don't know. I never really wanted to do that personally. Like, I get it, but that was never really my aim. But as soon as I sort of, found myself in a managerial role in Tsunderia, I really enjoyed it. So, yeah, it's been a really good, positive experience for me. And I personally haven't consulted with anyone for help with it. Every decision that I've made has sort of been like a logical one, so... But I'm glad I've received a lot of positive feedback from both fans and the streamers themselves, so, I'm definitely learning and improving every day that I do this, but, it's sort of nice to know that I'm already on the right track. It's a weak answer, but there nevertheless could be parallels between coaching kids and managing tubers. See, that's part of the conversation that goes into a topic that the industry is not yet ready for, which is how many business practices are currently only viable because of the demographics of the talent base. Using a kid's baseball coaching as an example of experience is like going, yeah, I have management experience, 9,001 hours in Hold 4, baby. Yeah, pretty much. Hold 4, yeah, there we go. Yeah, pretty much. And again, the fact that he said this in such an offhand manner is very... It certainly makes for an interesting viewing experience when you're watching this back years later. But then, at 2 hours, 29 minutes, 43 seconds, user Uniluna asks, what does PPP, the CEO, as a reminder, actually do for the company? To which S-Train replies, saying... He started it, is the short answer. Not only completely funded it on his own, from the very beginning, before it was even launched, but he also provides the direction the company goes and branches out to. This is actually the only part of the answer that has some utility down the line. Because now, when we look at the future of Tsunderia, when it unfolds and we evaluate the direction of the company, or lack thereof, we have someone whose responsibility it has been explicitly identified to be. He talks directly to the artists, he gets the contacts for the company, the illustrators, the modelers, the riggers, and then Charlotte interjects and says, he does all of the talking, even though he's the worst at it. But I think most importantly, he's the head of Tsunderia, and that's not a role either I or S-Train want to take. Now, generally speaking, CEO positions are not optimally given to those who are only there because no one else wanted it, right? If we're playing a game of White Elephant, CEO is possibly the most dangerous position to make the White Elephant. However, when considering the context of this answer, right, one of the things that does stand out as being, in hindsight, one of the more concerning aspects of the way that Tsunderia was run, and more importantly, how it was led, is when you go back and you actually look at who Tsunderia was registered under, going to their official registration on the the Californian Business Registrar, right? Biz Online. At the bottom of their entry, Tsunderia LLC is registered to an individual by the name of Jackie Lau. Search up Jackie Lau in LinkedIn and you get taken to this profile. which has, as part of listed experience, 4 entries. The first is a QA tester for Vault, full-time. The second is a junior developer working for Clear One Advantage. And the third and most important one for confirming the identity of who Jackie Lau is founder of Tsunderia LLC, self-employed. Now, I can't say for certain if this is indeed PPP, but just going off of this information, it very much does seem like Jackie Lau is indeed, the real name of PPP. And again, as people are already pointing out in chat, that's not a lot of managerial experience, right? Basically none. And this gets even more, again, one of the benefits of hindsight that we can exploit now, today, is we have a lot of other examples of CEOs, even other CEOs of other failed companies that we can use as a reference point to compare how bare this portfolio of experience is. And, well, let's just say, when you're getting mogged by Harry So from Nexus in terms of work experience, that's grim for your prospects as a CEO. Because if you look back, let's say, for example, we go to Harry's LinkedIn, right? Just like with Jackie, there are only 4 entries into his experience, section of his profile. In the first, he has a position as an intern at Takanumi Innovators. Sorry, give me a second. Holy shit, I sneezed so hard my monitor killed itself. Alright. Senor Tortillas, thank you for being a Footstool for a whole year. Hello, Chairman. Hello to you too. So, second, position at what it looks like Meetops, some Japanese company, presumably. Then, Associate Director of CEO Office. Now, granted, that is not CEO, but that is at least, presumably, some form of managerial experience, even if only through osmosis, right? Because, as we talked about when I did the stream on Nexus, his position as Associate Director seems to have only manifested in the form of giving him experience fetching coffees for actual company leaders. But, and again, that judgment based off of his performance running a company of his own. But again, that's at least an opportunity to see how it is done. And then only after that, CEO for Creators PTE Ltd, right? So again, when you compare these two examples side by side, yes, admittedly, both of them are CEOs of failed companies. But this is drastically less experienced in a managerial role when compared to others. And I'm not, we're going to ignore the work experience of CEOs of companies that are still operating today, because I don't think that needs to be said. So safe to say, right off the bat, Tsunderia did not exactly have the best starting lineup of people in charge, so to speak, to ensure the company's resilience in the face of increasing adversity, which was very much what was happening around the time, both due to circumstances outside of their control, the shifts in the industry, more companies coming into the industry, especially on the EN side, and also the stuff that was in their control when it comes to things like defining brand strategy, brand identity, how they were going to separate themselves rhetorically from the companies that they now shared a space with. However, that being said, it is not impossible that someone, even with an absence of experience, could have made the correct decisions when it comes to at least trying to make the brand different. Because, as we saw with Face Connect, for example, if a CEO is incompetent at something, for example, communicating with women, they could always hire someone who actually does have experience and, more importantly, competence with that thing. And, more importantly, once they hire them, presumably listen to them as well. That was one of the ways in which Tsunderia could have supplemented its starting vulnerabilities, the vulnerabilities that it essentially spawned in with. Because, yes, they had a lack of experience. But then again, so did most people who were trying to enter the industry at the time. That didn't mean, though, that there weren't other people outside of the original founding team of the company that, would have that experience. They could have still found someone with that degree of experience. All they needed to do was find them, hire them, convince them to get on board. And for the first EN-based agency to exist in the industry, that's not a very tough task, because they could, again, utilize that leverage that they possessed early on in their, in the company's history, to get someone who would have been won over by the cachet that is associated with that title, with that status. Again, like I said right at the beginning of the stream, Tsunderia did have inherent starting value as a brand, purely by virtue of being first. They just needed to use it before it expired. And the thing is, from the looks of it, they did seem to be using it. Or at least, they made an attempt. At 11 minutes 50 seconds in the AMA stream, a user by the name of Fluffy Fish asks for an outline of how many people work behind the scenes at Tsunderia, and to this, S-Train would give a reply basically outlining the company's structure. Specifically, he would identify 4 members of staff. 2 of them forming the executive body at Tsunderia, PPP, CEO, and himself being the CCO, as well as, head talent manager and head moderator. And then the other 2 members of the support staff, the people who would actually be interacting with talents on a day-to-day basis, presumably, being Charlotte, and also an unnamed member of the team who was in charge of marketing and operations. Now, who was this member of marketing and operations? Unclear. However, according to, starting at around 57 minutes 30 seconds, Charlotte would then give a little bit more detail as to the other role that this employee might have been, charged with, the other responsibilities that they might have had to take on as part of their role, right? Because Charlotte, in response to, someone asking for clarification as to what their roles were in Tsunderia, especially as members of management, she says, I pretty much work exclusively for startup companies. So this is in answer to, I believe this is an answer to the same question that was asking about what pre-existing experience the members of Tsunderia had running a company. So Charlotte says, I pretty much work exclusively for startup companies, so I actually have a lot of experience starting up companies. But most only on the product side. I know nothing about the business and the sales and the marketing side because I think money is icky. Sorry, this should be. I think I was cooked when I was typing this up because I wrote monkey by accident. Actually, come to think of it, I might have been typing this while I had another stream running on the background, which is why I end up typing this unconsciously. But in any case, I think money is icky. I absolutely, I hate touching money. I hate thinking about money. I don't want to think about money. But we did just hire a person to handle our business operations who's really good at starting up, or who knows a lot about starting up companies. So we're in good shape, I think. Now, this is perfectly normal, albeit this is one of the reasons why, again, with the benefit of hindsight, we can say for certain, using talents as members of management is probably not a great idea, because talents tend to be creative-minded people, and it is very, very common for creative-minded people to hate having to deal with things like payroll, things like money, things like, handling company finances. Those 2 skill sets are usually going to be in conflict with one another when they're jostling for headspace. So, apparently, at this point in time, sometime after the, perhaps sometime around even, or sometime shortly after the Tsunderia rebrand, maybe, sometime, at any point, within 2-3 months after the company was formally announced to the public, Tsunderia had managed to find someone, snag an employee who was good at all of the things that the current body of staff were either not good at or didn't want to do. Right? This unnamed employee who was good with things like payroll, who was also in charge of things like marketing, etc., etc. Now, again, who this was can't say for certain at this point in time. However, coincidentally, in early August, right, or August 26th of 2020, a VTuber by the name of Umiyushi Urara would take to r/virtual YouTubers to plug her upcoming debut. New VTuber Umiyushi Urara debut August 31st. Hello, Urara here. Nice to meet you. I am an EN VTuber debuting August 31st at 6 p.m. PST/PDT, and I'd love to see you there. And then goes on to list her hobbies, etc., etc. And again, Urara would end up making her debut at the end of August. Now, this is going to become a very important figure in part 2 of this topic, but for now, this is just something that's happening in the background to all of this. Now, to go on though, when it comes to understanding some of the fundamental philosophies that informed how Tsunderia went about communicating with its audience, right? This is, the philosophies that would end up ultimately shaping the PR strategy that Tsunderia would end up pursuing. And I would make the argument, one that other companies ended up adopting later, even if they didn't know that it came from Tsunderia. At 58 minutes 4 seconds, Charlotte, continuing on in her answer, would go on to say, "But as for me, I would say I think of the VTubers as products, and I care a lot about the interaction between the audience and the product." Now, a lot of people might look at this and they might instantly kind of go, oh, looking at VTubers as product is such a dehumanizing way of looking at it. But I think that this is not just a rational way of looking at it, but a beneficial one, especially if you are a member of management. Because at the end of the day, if you are running a company, it is your job to sell these creators to your audience, right? Not just to the audience that currently exists as part of their communities, but a wider group of people who may end up watching them in the future. And especially being able to identify which parts of that audience is going to be able to essentially buy merch, purchase memberships, subscribe, etc., etc. Because that is what your company relies on to continue providing support to your talents. You have to be able to think about it as a product that you are promoting. Yes, you should never do that to the detriment of also thinking of them as people. But at the end of the day, this idea of thinking about, VTubers as products that you need to sell to an audience is one that I think is severely underrated in the business, the profession of VTubing. But to go on, so I do think about that a lot, and I have a lot of general sense and intuition about where the company is heading, or what places or issues need to be fixed in order for the company to feel more secure and better. Like, if a company doesn't have enough transparency, then everyone in the company feels kind of mucky. Like, they don't know where they're headed, right? So it's pretty important to define what is success for Tsunderia and what our roadmaps are. Now, here's the thing. I do want to point out, right, that when we look at transparency, as much of a meme as it has become in this industry, when we consider how when transparency is used by a corporation, it is almost always, as a general rule, being used for purely cynical performative purposes. At this stage in the industry's development, that had not proven itself to be the case, or at least not on the EN side of things, because even though precedents existed on the JP side of things, people were not accustomed to looking over the pond to see what was going on. So, when it came to this, in the early stages of Corpo VTubing's development in the West, there was a lot of room for idealism. There was a lot of room for people to aspire to implement, realize certain values in the way that they did business that were probably implemented with good intentions, but turned out to ultimately be a dud later on. And I would make the argument that transparency is one of those things. So, that is to say, in this AMA, this stream, when Charlotte says, I want to make sure that transparency, that the company, that transparency is this thing that a company needs enough of. in order to function properly. While it is possible to sort of look at that and, roll your eyes, I don't think that that reaction would be reasonable when this comment is placed in context of where it came from, which is 2020, right? At a very different stage in terms of where the industry is now. And one of the things that, well, I suppose stood out to me when I was looking back at the way in which Tsunderia developed and eventually degenerated as a company is looking at how much of this idealism by specific members of the company, this pursuit of transparency, perhaps a little naively, as a sort of safeguard for the company's operation, means of operation, strategy, etc., etc. How much that was ultimately wasted and later on exploited by other companies with much more cynical intentions. Because the company that I keep comparing the communication, the promotion strategy to, when I'm looking at Tsunderia, is Vishojo. Because in a lot of ways, at least in their initial sales pitch, those two were basically mirrors of one another. However, when I look back at Tsunderia and the rhetoric that informed how the company promoted itself, I don't see the same cynicism that is, at least to me, or was at least to me, incredibly obvious with Vishojo. A lot of it does genuinely just seem to be wasted idealism, which I suppose is an element of tragedy. And again, this is not like, it's not something that I feel, because I'm not someone on the inside, nor am I a fan. But when you see, I'm trying to figure out how to put this in a way that isn't cringe. When you look at enough VTubing companies, and you look at enough stories of them collapsing in on themselves, while you have individual actors trying their best to plug the hole with their bodies, so to speak, it becomes very difficult to ignore that in addition to selling entertainment to the audience, the company is also selling dreams to the talents. Dreams are arguably one of the things, although it may sound pretentious, that keep companies like this afloat. And this idealistic, arguably naive dream that if you are honest enough with your audience, you can not only foresee, but prevent impending disaster with your company, the flaws that may exist within your company. It is never easy to see that being crushed, I suppose. And when I look back at, in the early stages, or even the middle stages of Tsunderia's development as a company, when I see that they built a PR strategy that was mostly based off of trying to be transparent with their audience, and how that didn't really do anything to stave off the problems in the company, because at the end of the day, no matter what degree of transparency you pursue, that can never make up for, executive incompetence, right? It's one of those things where you can only imagine what it must have been like to sort of just come to that place of disillusionment in real time. Because again, like I said, Vishojo was a company that, in my opinion, very much exploited idealism. But I think Tsunderia just wasted it. I don't know which one is worse, to be honest, but I think this one lends itself more to tragedy in hindsight than Bishoujo's does. Bishoujo's very much paints a story of hubris. This mostly just, again, I keep coming back to that word, but waste. I do wonder occasionally, this is kind of a little bit of a tangent from what we're currently discussing to do with Tsunderia, but I do wonder if there is a world in which transparency, I do wonder what a world in which transparency, if a world in which transparency never caught on as a promotional strategy for these corporations, I do wonder what that would look like. I do wonder if that would result in an industry that is in a better place than it is now. But I think ultimately that is a bit of a purposeless scenario. Because if Tsunderia didn't do it, then someone else was going to. I think transparency catching on as a cynical corporate, messaging strategy most definitely would have, it would have been popularized by somebody else if it wasn't Tsunderia. Because it's inevitable, right? You have an entertainment industry that revolves around essentially talents turning themselves inside out in order to build a connection with their audience. You can't have a situation like that and not come to the conclusion that transparency is the easiest ticket imaginable into the good graces of your audience when you are a company. Someone would have figured out how to exploit that at some point down the line, even if Tsunderia didn't end up, kind of doing it first. But yeah. Even if that didn't catch on, something else would. Yeah, it's not even something else. I think the same thing would have just caught on, but been popularized by a different actor, right? Intentions do matter at the end of the day. Trying to do the right thing does count for something. Yeah. And again, when I look back at Tsunderia, there were a lot of people trying to, do the right thing for the company to keep it afloat. But again, unfortunately, it kind of has to come from the top down. And I don't know if Tsunderia really had that much of a top to go down. Let's say, for want of a better way of putting it, obviously. But again, it's that matter of, if you don't know how to do something, just hand the reins over to someone who does, right? We have had examples of other companies that have done that and succeeded. But apparently that was not something that, the people who own Tsunderia felt like doing, whether out of hubris or something else. Billy, thank you for the super. It would be like the time you revealed feet. Thank you for keeping the tradition alive. But to move on with this, and then she goes on to say, I made PPP do all of that. So by that, she's referring back to, making a roadmap of where the company should be headed, right? And we're going to have more of a sense of security for everyone in the company. And I definitely want our audience, our watchers, to have peace of mind too, knowing that, like, we won't just disappear out of nowhere one day. And also, like, if we do happen to go down for somewhat terrible reasons, all of our VTubers will be able to swim independently and continue from there too. And then so again, this is a pretty understandable goal to have, right? Pretty understandable outlook to have, especially when you are a member of management that is also doing double duty as a talent, because you have the idealism of the latter combined with the responsibilities of the former. Now, again, with the benefit of hindsight, we know that that's not a healthy combination in any stretch of the imagination. But at this time, I think that was very much where this is coming from. However, what follows this is S-Train jumping in and then saying something that, again, little bit of foreshadowing for some of the possible controversies that will end up occurring in Tsunderia's history after this point, where he says, it's sort of like in my self-given title of communications officer. Personal communication is something that I've always, studied, sort of, in my free time. It's really frustrating for me on a very deep personal level, to see people working towards the same goal and, going at each other because they're not communicating. It's really frustrating for me to see that. So, being able to coordinate between like the streamers and the company, it's kind of my calling, I would say. Now, given what is going to occur only a few months after this AMA, methinks that S-Train perhaps took the communications a little too personally. But, for the moment, this is something that, it does sound like he's kind of sucking himself off a little bit. But, at the time, that was all this kind of was, right? And that's admittedly, me coming to that conclusion is also probably colored quite a little bit by the rest of what I absorbed when I was doing research for this topic. But one of the things that I am going to be bringing up this quote again in part 2, by the way. But one of the things that becomes incredibly disturbing in hindsight is how S-Train saying this at this point in time is very heavily recontextualized by the first graduation to occur in Tsunderia and some of the lore that was dropped in the aftermath of it. Because what seems like just a little bit of self-aggrandizement ultimately ends up becoming something almost akin to executive vague posting in hindsight. But to go on, when it comes to red flags, right, it's always a big one when it's always a bit of a red flag when someone's talking about this area of responsibility that they have as as an executive in a company, right? Communications officer, right? And then they go on to make that position all about themselves rather than the responsibilities that they have. So, again, this is just a little tidbit of information that we will revisit later on in this topic. But, for now, those were some of the red flags that were perhaps the most readily visible in terms of how Tsunderia advertised itself to its audience, right? Again, that mix of idealism and responsibility that accompanies when a talent is being when a talent has to do double duty as part of management as well. This sort of lack of experience among the executive body, this self-aggrandizement coming from someone who is in a position of rather significant power in an organization that is this small and this soon into its infancy. However, that being said, on the whole, this was still very much at a point in time where Tsunderia was very much in a position to flex without suspicion being cast upon it, right? After all, they were the first Ian-based VTuber agency. And these were all very noble intentions. Giving your talents freedom to do what they want very much sounds like a good thing. Wanting to be as transparent as possible with your audience, that very much appeals to Western sensibilities, so sure, why not? And also this entire thing about, wanting to break new ground and provide more representation to creators on the EN side of things, that was something that was a premise that was always going to be popular with an EN audience. Because mixed in among the viewers and subscribers and donators are going to be other talents who may end up wanting to be recruited by an agency at some point in the future, if only so that they are not alone in their journey to success. And so, it was a point in time where Tsunderia was very much in a position to benefit from their own novelty. And they would end up doing so, because a few months later, November 29th, 2020, Tsunderia would end up putting out the following tweet. Patch update. Update. Tsunderia Quest is live. New characters added. Please support them on their adventures. Along with the following Gen trailer. Let's pull this up. This may contain copyrighted music. Okay. So again, pretty obvious conceit, right? Tsunderia quest is in, like, a quest that you get in a game, and then as we will end up seeing, the VTubers who were part of this gen were also all structured based off of a character archetype in a kind of RPG-esque setting. So
Oh, hello. Are you ready to start your journey? We're so excited.
oh wait, I just forgot. I need to switch over to the other screen. Okay, there we go. Hold on. Is it showing for you guys? Wait, give me a second. Let me fiddle around with a few things. Okay, there we go. Much better. Okay, now it should be resized so that nothing's cropped off.
Excited to meet you. Promise us that you'll support us every step of the way, okay? Now let's see. Our story begins with 4 heroines. Huh? Wait, you guys started without me? Hey, wait up!
I love my recommended algorithm. All right, so as you can see, well, okay, if, by the way, if the chat replay goes down, that's probably why. I don't know what the music in the background was, but on the off chance that it's copyrighted, that, if chat replay goes down, that's probably why. So, hold on, let me just turn on the BGM. This was pretty hype moment in reference to, the rest of the Ian Corpo industry. Very first Ian-based Corpo releasing its very first full gen, right? Because again, Gen 0 was, they were a gen, but they did not debut as a gen. And as we've talked about on previous streams, especially what I think I was talking about Vishojo, there is a degree of cohesiveness to the brand of a new gen that you can only get if you debut them together as a single unit, right? So this was a step forward that had big implications, right? Because this was essentially like this was a legitimizing stamp on the agency, because not only were they able to get a whole bunch of talents, but they were able to get them all in sync with one another and debut them as a single cohesive product, right? And so, to follow up with this, on December 15th, they would then outline not just who these talents were going to be, but also when exactly they were going to be debuting, all 4 of them, the 4 original members of Sunquest, now called Sunquest, debuting between the 18th and 19th of December. Fast forward a few days, and lo and behold, those 4 members, Kalin, Meru, Ria, and Yuna, would all end up debuting under the banner of Tsunderia Quest. Along with these like little bios that they posted. Now, I chose to use these instead of the thumbnails because some of their debut streams are, I believe that they are lost. So this makes for a more consistent visual imagery. So along with their names, they would post these little blurbs on the graphics as well. Kalin unleashes her super dark seducer, seduction ultimate, night attack into the night. So immediately you get the vibe that, this is kind of toony, right? You have that kind of, you have that kind of a little bit more on the raunchy side, so to speak, but not out, a little lewd, but not out overtly sexual, Then you have Meru, you've got her, someone who's, implied to be, high energy, supportive, etc., etc. Rhea squeaks into battle, again, kind of chuny, cute, small, rodent, etc., etc. And Yuna, crispy crunching, comfy streamer, right? So you have a pretty good range of different personas, different personalities, different characters, so to speak, that are debuting. I hate using that word in connection with VTubers, but again, at this point in time, before they actually start streaming, that is kind of what they are. And then, lo and behold, each of them would also end up debuting with a cover as well, or in the case of Rhea, a full-fledged original song. So with Callan, she would be debuting with a cover of Kyun Vampire Girl by Idolmaster 2, or part of Idolmaster 2. I'm not familiar with what that is. Then Meru would be debuting with a cover of Ijime, Dame, Zetai. Rhea would be debuting with an original song titled, if I translated this correctly, Soku no Aosa. And then Yuna debuting with a cover song of Ame ni Utaeba. So again, it very much did. Part of the reason as to why the release of this gen was so huge for Tsunderia was because, remember what I said earlier, that they were only left with a few things they could do in order to innovate on their brand, a few things to double down on, to pivot towards, in order to really separate themselves from the other competitors that were emerging, especially the one that had that were the most loud about the same talking points, was music. That was the thing that, that was the aspect of their branding that they had a lot of room to innovate on. This was a very clear sign that that is what they were trying to do at this point in time. And the thing is, it did seem like it was working, because when you release your first gen as a company, when you take the step to make sure that they not only release with, the models that you've provided to them, right? But also with things like a debut song, lore video, etc. Lore video conveys that you've actually, it is an at least symbolic indicator that you have invested significant effort and forethought and given your talent some say in how they are going to play that character, so to speak, right? Lore, while it is not really something that has much utility in day-to-day VTubing, it is ultimately, especially for corpos, a very easy way to get your talent's input into what their character is going to be like, and give them a little bit of room to express that to their audience before they even start streaming. Then, when you have things like debuting with a cover song, you very much convey that, yeah, you are willing to sink quite a bit of money into your talents as an initial investment, but also that, especially in the case that you are a company that wants to specialize in going in a more music-focused direction, that conveys that that is what you are doing. Also, on top of that, Yuna, she was not Tsunderia property. She was not Tsunderia IP. She was an indie that was recruited as part of SunQuest by Tsunderia. When you have a debut generation, and one of them includes an indie that had a pre-established presence prior to their involvement with your company, or your company's involvement with them, that sends a very clear message. You have something to offer. And things like releasing the first gen are huge, because as we will end up touching on in part 2, this is part of what ends up adding to the cachet of your company. This is part of what ends up creating the basis for other people to want to join your company in future, not just as members of your community, but as talents in their own right. The more talents you have, well, when you do have talents and you release them like this, they become the foundations upon which to build what I've referred to on stream before as your corporation's myth, so to speak, right? This is the, at risk of sounding a little pretentious, a corporate myth is the apotheosis of a strong brand, right? Basically to the point where people start integrating it not just into how they consume, but into how they think, into what they dream about, into their own life goals and aspirations. that is when your corporation's identity goes from just being a marketing tool to being something that has real, tangible pull amongst your audiences. And things like releasing a cohesive gen like this, that goes a long way towards solidifying that pull. Again, at this point in time, I just I keep I have moments when I'm talking, I'm like gesturing towards my screen, and then I realize you guys can't see me. And then I think, oh, okay, well, at some point, maybe in the future, when I end up getting a model, you guys will be able to see. But then I remember, I'm a fucking chair. So even if I do end up pointing and stuff, you're not really going to see me doing that, because at best, it's just going to be a model tilting one way or another. But that little thing aside, I'm pointing at, this in general, right? Just them as a group. This was, for the time being, the best thing that Tsunderia could have done with the starting amount of novelty, leverage, and clout that they had as the very first Ian-based the very first Ian-based company. Right? Yes, Gen Zero was very, very important to getting them an audience to start off with. Their versatility is the reason why Tsunderia was even able to take off in the first place. But once you have that solid foundation to build off of, you need to make a show of strength. Because, well, if you don't do that, you kind of just piss away what kind of relevance that you started off with. And Tsunderia, when they released Sun Quest, that was a very clear sign to everyone watching that this was a company that was looking to grow, that had something to offer. And that is incredibly important, because I would make the argument that immediately after this point in time, right after the debut of Sun Quest, was when Tsunderia as a brand was at its most potent. This was when they had the maximum amount of novelty and leverage that they would go on to have for the rest of the company's existence. This was Tsunderia at the height of its influence in the industry. And I say this, and some of you, again, understandably, may question me coming to that conclusion, and you're welcome to. But even though you can make the argument that there are, and again, this is something I will be touching on in part 2, there are going to be larger creators who end up joining Tsunderia after this point. Part of the reason as to why I say that this is the height of Tsunderia's leverage, novelty, and relevance is because you need that in order to attract larger names. And it's after you've recruited said larger names that, in my opinion at least, the amount of leverage you possess as a company peaks. So, at this particular point in time, Tsunderia was at the height of its brand's power, potency, and distinctiveness, at least in my opinion, right? And the defining things that made them different, made them special as a brand, was the whole talent management crossover, strong focus on music, at least going forward, starting from Sun Quest. Them being the very first EN-based corpo, which even though at this point, it has now been just over 6 months since they formally announced that they were even a thing, right? That cachet was still going strong for this company. The whole idea, quite novel idea for the time at least, of being transparent with your audience and making that one of the pillars of your communication strategy. This whole idea of giving your talents freedom because that would make their content better. And finally, after having just debuted a fresh generation, cohesive, one unit, including someone who was already an established creator before they joined your company. Again, these are all the signs of a company that has fresh ideas, that has somewhere to go, that has something to offer as well. And it is at this point that I am going to cap off this stream And we will be continuing from this point, looking at how Tsunderia ended up shifting as a company after reaching this peak in terms of its brand's potency and distinctiveness. Essentially, power, right? And so, yeah, I'm going to be leaving that one off here. But again, for those who are just looking at and watching my content for the first time, I hope this does give you a little bit of an idea as to what my coverage, how, my look into Tsunderia is going to go. It's going to be a lot more of this. A lot more of, well, looking at their PR strategy, how they marketed themselves, the different aspects of their brand, and how they interacted with their competitors, etc., etc. As well as, again, some of the glimpses behind the curtain that the public was given, some intentionally, some not so much, some not so much so, into what made Tsunderia dysfunctional as a company, and why, in my opinion at least, burying that, memory holding that, and forgetting about it is something that I think is detrimental to the industry as a whole, because it has happened again since. Yeah, it's about momentum, fundamentally. That's a good way of putting it, Kirnoth. I'm sure doing the to be continued me. Yeah. Basically. But again, hopefully you understand my reason for splitting it in this manner. Because everything I'm going to be talking about in part 2 is the less, let's say, less positive side of how Tsunderia ended up unfolding as a company. Pavlo, thank you for being a Footstool for 2 months. This is a great part 1. Can't wait to see part 2. I'll be putting up the waiting room after I'm done with this stream. I'll also be timestamping this stream for ease of viewing afterwards as well, in between when I do the next stream. And yeah, so only 2 parts. I'm not gonna drag this out to, like, something that goes over half a week, right? I want to get this again. The whole reason why I'm splitting it up is, well, I mean, one of the biggest reasons to why I'm splitting it up is hopefully as a sort of admittedly kind of sentimental, but a bit of a gesture of good faith towards those who have extended the same to me when it comes to, again, the way I'm going to be talking about this topic. Just to give people an idea as to what they should expect. Because I don't expect that, I don't expect that a lot of these people are going to have an idea as to how I make content, right? But this is I hope that this was a somewhat functional compromise to give people an idea of what to expect. But yeah, 24/7. I think that's a bit ambitious. I've done 10 hour. I've done like 10+ hour streams before, but I think that while I think that Tsunderia could certainly accomplish that, I want to make the viewing experience a little bit more palatable, I suppose, for people who are not accustomed to me going that long. But yeah, missing out on not milking it. I don't think... How do I say this? I don't think I can say anything to really convince people that I'm not doing this for cynical reasons, right? Because realistically speaking, that is, I'm very conscious that is an incentive that exists, right? But, and this is probably something I'll end up looping on at the end of the next, the part 2 of this stream as well, but the entire reason as to why I decided to do this stream, like the thing that gave me the idea to start looking into Tsunderia to begin with, was a post that I made on Twitter way back in January of this year. So basically around the time, to give people context, I was working on a little bit of a side project where that at the end of January, I just come off of a month where I had essentially speedrun doing Agamata. Hello, welcome to the stream. I just got here, is it already over? I'm kind of wrapping up, but I don't really blame you for only reaching the tail end of it, because this is I am doing something quite different from what I usually do for my streams. But in both terms of, you know, the time slot and also the way that I'm splitting up the topic. But yeah, so at the end of January, I just come off of an entire month where I essentially went week after week dissecting the implosions of different companies in an effort to try and find common themes that can be used to create a set of red flags and prejudices against other companies going forward. Essentially a sort of a list of things to look for, almost an official trust rating that VTubers could use when applying to different companies. And that was the thing that I was working on. Actually, Murray was very helpful to me when I was doing this, because he was one of the people that I consulted when I was trying to decide on what criteria to put into this, you know, this hypothetical rating system. So after I got a number of those dot points down, right, these things that could be used in order to, you know, these things to look out for when you're applying for a new company, what I needed then was feedback, right? And obviously the best feedback that I could get was feedback from people who had been part of these companies that had collapsed, and for them to tell me if, based off of this list of things to look out for, they would have been in a better position to avoid the, you know, to avoid falling for whatever, you know, whatever grift, whatever company would only end up imploding soon, you know, soon after they joined. Right? Would it have actually changed their opinion on whether they wanted to join said imploded company or not? And I made a post on Twitter basically asking for talents who had been part of these companies to contact me if they were interested in providing feedback for something like this. And in the post, I set a cutoff date where I asked specifically for people who had been part of companies that had imploded over the course of the last year, so 2024. And at the time, the rationale behind me setting that limit was because mostly of timeliness, right? The whole idea that all of these collapses were fresh on everybody's minds. 2024 was an especially bloody year for corporate implosions as well. So I wagered that that would also give me a, you know, a significant range of possible feedback to draw from. But yeah, I made that post, I left it there. And then I think it was Amia Aranya ended up commenting under that post, asking why only 2024 and onwards. And when I read that comment, I I remember having an initial moment, like I had a pause, right, and then I went, wait, shit, why did I set the cutoff to that point, like. Because I knew that there had been companies that had imploded prior to that point, but part of it was me kind of having, it sounds stupid, right, in hindsight, but part of it was me in that moment having, oh shit, wait, that does kind of exclude some of the, you know, some of the earliest companies to collapse, etc., right? And I don't. While I'm not, you know, I don't think that you know, I don't think by leaving that comment she meant that she, you know, wanted to engage in something like that. But in hindsight, I don't know if this is something that's going to make its way back to her, but or if she chooses to watch this or whatever. But I do appreciate how that simple question kind of made me rethink the sort of unconscious recency bias that I had when I was looking for things like case studies and things like feedback on a project like that. And I am going to say as well, Lisa wasn't the only one who commented under my announcement on Twitter that I was going to be tackling this topic on stream, because Amia left a comment as well, basically just yeah, she was very polite and tactful about it, basically saying, you know, not saying that this isn't going to happen, but you know, just please be respectful to the talents and stuff when you're going through this topic, right? And I'm not saying that this is what she was thinking, because I'm not going to presume to know what, you know, other people what other people are thinking. But when I read that, I interpreted that as kind of like a sign of apprehension or concern, possibly, you know, even suspicion at the fact that I was going to talk about this topic. And I just want to say, like, I understand why that might have been the case. Not saying that that was the case, but I am going to say that, you know, if you are an ex-Tsunderia talent, or you're a fan of someone who was formerly of Tsunderia, and you look at my announcement that I'm going to be talking about this topic, and you did feel apprehensive, suspicious, or just a bit concerned as to how this was going to go, I do understand why you would, especially considering my content niche. Right? And especially when you go from one post, right, where it's basically, it almost looks as if I'm purposefully excluding companies like Tsunderia from the selection criteria, from consideration, and then you fast forward a few months, and then I'm suddenly going like, oh, I'm going to talk about Tsunderia. I understand if you put those two side by side with one another, you're probably going to go, okay, what changed? Why now? You know, what's going on here? But yeah, no, I mean, I'm not going to say that this is definitely going to be something that that you're going to enjoy, but I do hope that it's not as bad as what you envisioned. Probably not familiar with the fact that you approach these topics from an academic standpoint. I don't expect people to be familiar with that, to be honest, because there is precious little difference, right, between... How do I say this? Never expect someone to watch your content in order to rectify an impression they have of your content, so to speak. Especially if that impression would disincentivize them to watch your content. So for that reason, when I'm looking at people who are, you know, kind of concerned about how I'm going to cover things because of the fact that I talk about, you know, I've said this before on stream that, yeah, when you take away the dressing, I am like a drama tuber, right? I understand why people look at that and they instantly go like, yeah, I don't know about that one, right? But yeah, it's... For what it is worth, I do not do this with the intention of trying to... Well, I mean, this is kind of symbolic, but in the sense that I don't think I'm going to change anyone's mind with this. But for what it's worth, I don't approach these with the intention of exploiting them, so to speak. I do wish that the industry had a better capacity for retaining, remembering, and acting based off of past fuck-ups in order to improve how things go in the future. That is part of why I go back and I look at topics like this, even if they have not been talked about for a while. And, well, sometimes I do try to turn them into things like that. The trust ratings thing, I ended up posting it onto Twitter, but I didn't end up getting a lot of traction. I think in hindsight it was because the graphic design was fucking awful. I should know, I made it. But I might end up retouching it and maybe posting it a second time, seeing if it does a little bit better. But this is thoroughly like off topic, right? It's just me yapping to you guys after the planned portion of this stream is over. But I have for a while now been kind of considering what is the primary value of what I do. Because I am under no delusion that I am going to be able to change this industry or whatever. But, and also I think that I've reached a point where the catalog that I've managed to build up over the year and a half that I've been streaming, and when I look at, the way that you guys end up reacting to things as I'm talking about them during stream as well, I do think that we've reached a point where the concepts that I'm introducing are not novel, but we've moved on to the point where now we are actively applying them, and it is very gratifying to me when I see that you guys are able to apply them as I'm streaming, right, to the topics that I'm talking about, that's ultimately, the best feeling when you're trying to impart some sort of, information to others. But I think that one of the other things that I would like for this channel to be in terms of a resource or in terms of something to contribute is an archival one. When it comes to trying to beat back the tide of internet amnesia that plagues this industry. And yes, some of that is going to require dredging up controversies that are dead and buried, but that is why I insist on you guys maintaining a policy of policy of non-involvement when it comes to the subjects that we are discussing, right? So that, I can have this function of talking about things from the past, and at the same time, people will only engage with it if they make the conscious choice to do so of their own volition. But yeah, entertainment, growing a community that enjoys your live lectures. Yeah, basically. I mean, when it comes to this niche, right, the content niche that I occupy, there are a few ideal outcomes of what it ends up embodying, right? It's, the ideal outcomes are to inform, to entertain, and to archive, right? Those are the three, in my opinion, the three ideals of what this content niche could be. But that's often not the reality of it. I have for a while kind of how do I say? I understand why people don't often last very long in this niche. Because at a certain point, looking at failure after failure and trying to... If you try to learn something from it, if you try to get people to avoid making the same pitfalls, it does feel a little Sisyphean after a while. And at that point, usually what ends up happening is you either end up burning out or you become like a kind of cynical parody of yourself. But I've tried to compromise by, I don't know how to put this, but sort of the task feels less Sisyphean if I'm only focusing on people who choose to consume my content, I suppose. Because the problem is when you talk about these kinds of topics, if you try to push them in people's faces, that is very counterproductive. It's also just, impolite. But even if you're thinking of it purely from a utilitarian standpoint, it doesn't work, right? Because, people, you have reactance theory. People don't want to engage with it because you force them to. And as a result, even if there is something of value in there, You know, again, ignoring the fact that the value when it comes to entertainment, which is fundamentally what this is and tries to be, right? You know, the value of entertainment is purely subjective, right? It's just not going to take. It's just never going to be absorbed. It's never going to be useful in any way because the usefulness is going to be negated essentially by the manner in which it was pushed. The medium is the message, and if the medium is that it gets shoved in your face, then yeah, it's kind of over. That's not exactly a very beneficial message to send. Self-loathing leads to nowhere. Yeah. And I have seen a lot of people in the same content niche fall into self-loathing. And frankly, I understand why. Because at a certain point, what do you really, you have to ask yourself the question, what are you really accomplishing by doing this? What are you really accomplishing by talking about this stuff? Right? And if the only answer is, I get money out of it, I mean, that's grand for you, right? But it's kind of I suppose it's kind of ironic because at the end of the day, I suppose that assessment of things is a little overly idealistic in and of itself. But don't get me wrong, I like money, right? But if I didn't feel like there was a point behind doing this content beyond just, herder, I get ad revenue, I feel like this would be corrosive to the soul. Because when I talk about things like corporations selling people dreams, right? As pretentious as that assessment of things may sound, I do genuinely feel like that is exactly what is going on in this industry. And obviously, if you are a company that's selling dreams to your talent, that also puts you in a position where you can break them as well. And you go through enough of these implosions, you go through enough instances where you see people in real time kind of losing a little bit of the... I'm trying to search for a way to put this that isn't overdone. But to be honest, it's a little difficult at this point in time. But you see people kind of die inside over and over. And you start noticing similarities and patterns in terms of how things end up unfolding, what ends up happening, the warning signs that are there, but people either ignore or, stigmatize acknowledging. And it all feels kind of hopeless sometimes. I said this before, but pattern recognition is a curse and a blessing. It's a blessing when you use it to keep yourself safe. Again, it's another phrase I can't say without sort of, catching on itself. But boy, does it make for does it make you a bit of a buzzkill when it comes to just, putting your head down and enjoying things. But, to be honest, some people don't want to be helped. Yeah, and again, that's why my target audience is specifically you guys, right? People who do have the same interest in looking at things in this manner. Because, well, frankly speaking, one of the things that I find, and this is something I've talked about before, but one of the things that I find cathartic about doing this kind of content, applying these concepts to things as, as something as seemingly incongruous as VTuber corporation implosions, is having the holy Prince, thank you for the Arca Super. Holy shit, thank you for your generosity. Become a Footstool today and join us for the members only Footathon. Stop hazing the newbies by falsely advertising to them. Through humanity's existence, at the end of each stream we get a picture of one of Chairboss's toes. At the 11th stream we put them all together like Exodia. No, just in case, Does anyone new who's watching? No, that doesn't happen. That's misinformation. That's fake news. But yeah, no, back to what I was saying before. I find it cathartic to be able to use these concepts that have taken, decades and millions in order to put to paper, and then use them as a way of expressing that the things that you are observing happening around you are not just in your head. They are objectively provable. They are happening for a reason. And you can articulate what that reason is in the hopes that maybe you'll be able to communicate it to somebody else. That's why I talk about these things. Because things like looking at the pillars of a brand, one of the recurring things that I kept seeing come up over and over when I was looking at other people talking about Tsunderia was the whole idea that it was wasted potential. That the reason why the company died was because of the apathy of the people in charge. And I think that when you're sort of just left to conclude that on your own, right? It can be very easy over time to either romanticize that away or to default to blaming yourself instead for how things went. And I don't think that's... well, I mean, for want of a better way of phrasing it, I don't think that's necessary. I don't think you have to default to either, well, that's just how things are, or, well, I guess I could have done my bit to maybe slow down the way in which things collapse. Because I have seen that as well, like, people who were formerly of Tsunderia blaming themselves for aspects of its failure, right? Things that were frankly out of their control. And I think that, for what it's worth, I do want to hopefully provide some form of explanation to show that, when people say that Tsunderia had wasted potential and that apathy quite literally killed the company, that's not just a vibe, that's not just a feeling, that is objective and provable through decades of academic theory. When I talk about things like brands having an expiry date, when I talk about brands losing their leverage over time because of how the more competition reduces the extent to which their identifiers remain valid and to which they are able to differentiate themselves from the competition. That's why I do this, so that hopefully it becomes more objective. You can say it in a more objective manner than just, this is how I feel about it. Because there is certainly a place and time for that. And this may be me projecting a little bit here, but I always find it to be unsatisfactory when all I can say about something is, it's because I feel that way. I want to be able to articulate why things are the way that they are. And perhaps that is something that is a little bit perhaps that is something that may be unpopular, right? And I'm not saying that that is the right way of doing things, though I will make the argument that if your objective is to make money and to improve things, then yes, that is the right way to do things. But if you're just dealing with processing information, I find that to be unsatisfactory. And at the end of the day, I want people to be able to know that it's not just in their heads, right? I suppose... yeah, exactly. The idea that there is some method behind the madness, that we're not constantly trapped in this loop where we have no idea of what's about to come next, and we could never have any idea of what's about to come next, right? The constant state of perpetual... It's that rhyme that I came up with during the Reshoujo stream all over again, right? Like, so much of the EN side of this industry is always on the back foot, constantly surprised, eyes tightly shut but mouth open wide, right? And at least part of the goal behind my content is, maybe conveying that doesn't have to be the case. And part of the ways in which I think that can be overcome is not not memory holing or whitewashing what happened to companies like Tsunderia. And again, I'm not saying that I have never done that in the past. I was very much part of the EN, the EN audience that had no clue what the fuck a Tsunderia was back in the day. And for the most part, for the longest time, actually, even while doing this content, I just never considered, digging into Tsunderia as a topic. I knew that it existed. I've heard people talk about it before, but that was the extent of my knowledge, and I never really felt the need to change that until I made that post back in January, and and I read that reply, because that was the moment where I realized, hang on a second, do I actually have a good reason for, implementing that cutoff when it comes to looking at information? And yeah, in hindsight, it's pretty obvious, right? But yeah. Oh, you're from Argentina. My condolences, hermano. It's alright, it's alright. There's a place for everybody here, so long as you are equally for exclusion and prejudice. Oh, by the way, I don't think I expanded on that while I was at that section of the stream. But the reason why differentiation is often the part of branding that is glossed over is because, for some reason, mainstream culture, especially mainstream corporate culture, has really stigmatized the idea of exclusion. Right? People, everything needs to be inclusive, everything needs to accommodate everybody. But the problem is, in order to differentiate your company from others, you have to be okay with excluding certain demographics from your possible pool of consumers, or your target audience, essentially. In order to differentiate your company from differentiation requires exclusion. And that's why it's the part of branding that is often glossed over or not talked about. Nowadays, at least. So, again, if you want to send a clear message to your target audience, that requires you exclude the other audiences aside from that, right? And again, that's the part that people don't talk about as much. And it sounds weird to most people nowadays when you say exclusion is like a good and necessary thing, especially when it comes to something like branding. But again, that's kind of how it goes. So, yeah, when I talk about that being under discussed, that's why. VTubing industry is for everybody. That doesn't mean people have to change so you feel included. Yeah, exactly. Well, VTubing is not really... The thing about VTubing is that there is room for everybody, but it's not for everybody. And I get that may sound self-contradictory as a statement, but what I mean by that is it's not up to anybody but yourself to carve out a niche for you in this industry. If you can carve out that niche, then good on you. You're entitled to it. But there's no point in coming in here and expecting other people to bend over backwards to accommodate you. That's not going to happen. That's what having a target demographic is. Exactly. You'd be surprised at how many people gloss over that, though. Exclusioning people is like a binding vow, gain something by giving up something. Yeah, and it's kind of like the underlying principle of nothing in this world is free, right? You have to have an if or. You can't have an and but, right? It's, well, not an and but, but an and as well for all of the things that you want in life, right? You have to make compromises in order to get what you want. You have to decide even before that point what you want in the first place. Yeah, it's accessible, but it's not made for people. I think that's a pretty good way of putting it, Pavlo. No, this is wrong. Yeah, that is a fundamental philosophical difference that I hold with Iron Mouse, personally. It's like in Ratatouille, anyone can cook. Yeah, well, I mean, anyone can cook if they leave it to somebody else to pull the strings, right? Same thing with VTubing. Sorry, I'm 3.5 hours late, but giving chairman streams, this is still the preamble. Nah, this is I'm just yapping. This is the tail end of the stream. Sorry, excuse me. Give me a second. Oh yeah, I will. I will. Don't worry. I will get to all of the super chats and the memberships in a second. On the contrary, Favelo, I think you are very much the target demographic for VTubers. To be honest, I think old and retired is quite a significant portion of a lot of VTubers' fan bases. Postamble, yeah, there we go. Jesunhai, yeah, pretty much. Actually retired might be in the demographic. Yeah, exactly. Hold on. Let me switch over to the head horde screen so I can pull up stream elements. Hopefully this works. I think it's very interesting that most inclusive people are often the ones that judge the most. Yeah, because it's become a social signifier of virtue. That's always the problem, right? The people who cling hardest to those signifiers are also the ones who, well, to be frank, need them the most. I was not expecting the stream to be so short. Yeah, again, I am adjusting this so that it is a little more accommodating to people who don't usually watch my stuff. Really, I guess I have more fellow travelers than I realized. I mean, I've seen you in Morlington's chats, right? Morlington is very much a kindred soul in that regard. And honestly, I think that a lot of VTubing audiences are like, I like Morlington. To be honest, they're just, they're chill. They seem to be at a reasonably comfortable place in life, and they're just looking for something to. They're looking for something to entertain, to escape into, to aspire towards, or to view as something is inspirational, I suppose. Not to put it in a way that is a little too, pretentious. Hold on, let me. Oh no, my Streamlabs is still loading. For fuck's sake. Alright. I'm a younger one. So, holy, you're a baby, Miroslav. You don't even know how young you are, relative. You're never too young nor too old. Click that like button. Yeah, click that like button. Hit. Honestly, right now, I don't even know if subscribing is a good thing, right? Like, I don't know if subscribing, if you're not going to watch future streams, helps in the algorithm. Because from everything, I don't know if it's just restricted to shorts, but from everything that I've seen, when someone receives more subscribers than actually watch their regular content, it's actually worse for them in the long run in terms of how the algo receives them. But yeah, I mean, if you like the video, only subscribe if you feel like this is content you would probably come back to in the future, though. Don't feel pressured to do that. Men with good jobs but no family to spend money on. Yeah, Agamata, that's a pretty concise way of summing up the main target demographic for VTubing, to be honest. Yeah. I'm still looking. Like, I'm still looking for for a possible collab partner that I can do that, that sex demographic to business to practice viability stream with. I think it would be a fun stream topic to have someone on for. But again, the challenge is finding someone who is willing to gaze into the abyss, so to speak. Master, I think about the two. Talked about Maria last time. Now, oh yeah, no. Yeah, I saw. I am planning on. Well, I mean, I'm going to see how that one turns out, because I think the last that the agency ended up addressing it, they said that they were open to talks. So I'm curious to see where that goes. But then afterwards, yeah. Then afterwards, I'm going to revisit that topic. Brave is a topic that is, for now at least, that is my main target. That is the thing that's taken up the most of my headspace for the past few months, basically. because whatever is going to happen with Brave, I don't think it's going to have wide-reaching consequences for the industry, but it is going to be a fascinating case study in just how big you can blow up a hot air balloon like that. Mare, can you elaborate on that sex demographic? Yeah, it's the thing that I talked about earlier, right? The whole how many and what practices in this industry are only viable because of the sex demographics of both the audience and the talent pool. Because I suspect that there are quite a few examples of business practices that would fail if you switch them around. I'm 33. Yeah, you're still young. I'm only 25, but I watched some of Keys in the Eyes' earliest videos when they came out. Yeah. I am also... Holy... I hope that's a joke, Sai, because holy, that you are a fetus, if that is true. I'll ask DN. No. Okay, so... DN is actually... Oh, fuck. Wait, no, I need to check out DMs. No, I was going to say... DN was one of the reasons as to why I got into Brave Group to start off with. Because I was asking around for just, someone who could bring me up to speed on what the Game Club controversy was. And he was the first person that I hit up. And he was able to pass on, all of the, the stuff that he had in his video about Brave Group, the archived web pages and stuff like that. So, yeah, DN is part of the reasons to why I went down that rabbit hole, no pun intended, to begin with. So, yeah, I have him to thank for that. And also Nene Love was basically giving a very concise visual way of conveying the depths to which Brave Group in current day is willing to go for hot air, so to speak. Good man in that funny fucker. Chairman is Azuma. He recently escaped college. Down, Billy. Alright, hold on. Let me go back to YouTube and see if I can grab the super chats from there, because that's probably better than waiting for Streamlabs to function. I don't know why it occasionally does that thing where it just doesn't show newer entries. Hold on. Give me a second. Where is it? I don't know what time zone Nene Love operates off of, but he usually ends, if he does end up showing up during a stream, it's usually when I'm in my normal time slot of somewhere around 9 PM EST. This is very much not 9 PM EST, so yeah. And I mean, the two topics that he's shown the most interest in so far that I've covered are Brave Group, which is understandable considering how much effort he invested of his own time into trying to essentially create an easily transmissible summary of why exactly that company is such a clusterfuck, and also VShojo, because, well, I mean, I think we all understand why VShojo is a favorite topic among some of the people here. Hold on a second. Let me pull it up. I'm in college suffering through literal final exams. I hope those go well for you. Because, well, and I hope you find employment that is granted to you by your degree rather than in spite of it as well. Hold on. Okay, there we go. Oh, I always get jump scared by Billy super chats. Gabriel, thank you for the super. Wait, is Armchair implying that the bear scene in BG3 was due to female Gooner influence? Well, not so much female Gooner influence, but just a cultural shift in general that has made it more socially acceptable to talk about things that would previously be taboo, right? When you talk about gaming, I forget exactly where that trailer was shown. Was it during the Game Awards at one of the years preceding the release of Baldur's Gate 3? Can someone clarify that in chat? Because I don't really remember it. But I remember it was at one of those those normie events around celebrating game dev or whatever, or how many copies got sold by whatever game. But yeah, it's normie culture has shifted to the point where it is now acceptable to openly talk about the goon material that you would previously keep to yourself out of shame in decades past. One of the things that I that I didn't touch on was how back in the day, one of the other things that made 50 Shades of Grey such a sensation in general was obviously it was, very palatable to normies because of the whole it's quite vanilla for smut thing. But on top of that, it was just controversial enough, or it was viewed as controversial enough to get people to start talking about it. Because you had people who were anti-porn, who were really up in arms about the fact that it got a movie, because, that's basically pornography, but shown to general audiences. But you also had people who were part of the so-called BDSM community, who were up in arms because 50 Shades of Grey portrayed BDSM as an inseparable, almost an inseparable parasite that was attached to abuse, right? Oh, sorry, other way around. That BDSM and abusive tendencies were one and the same thing, right? So they were up in arms about it. They started talking about it because of that. Again, my main point is it was viewed as socially acceptable while simultaneously controversial. Whereas nowadays, something like Game of Thrones would not be viewed as either, right? It would kind of just be like hand waved away. Because again, normie culture has gotten to the place where now you walk into a bookstore, you look to your left, and you see a whole bunch of, porn, stuff that borders on, fantasy tinged bestiality, etc., etc., etc. Right? All of this degeneracy that is on full display. And let's be honest here, right? We know who those books are for. We know they're not really literature in the shall we say the more honest meaning of the word. So it's yeah. I'm honestly jealous of the amount of vocabulary you have. I was gonna ask how you did it, but then I realized you fucking studied. The words that I use, for the most part, are not even because of media. I try to use words in spite of what you're taught to do in university. Because in university, usually you're taught to speak in a way that is verbose without any purpose behind it. Or at least, not taught that actively, but more encouraged to do so via incentives. Because you have word counts you need to fill or whatever the fuck. But in general, the reason I have the vocabulary I do is just because I hate the feeling of wanting to describe something and lacking the ability to articulate it. So I just find words. Women's romance novels are wild. Yeah, exactly, right? Everyone knows the meme of Morning Glory Milking Club. Actually, earlier on in the stream, I brought up that exact example, Agamata. But yeah, no, it's kind of wild. I see the stuff that you draw on Twitter, right? Like, I see the art that you make, which is, every single piece is, chef's kiss. Like, I see the stuff that you make as a meme, right? And then I go to a local bookstore or whatever, and then I go into, the romance section. I look at the premises for some of those novels in quotation marks. And it's that, but without any hint of irony or humor. it's just that played straight, pretty much. Frankly, I would respect it more if it was made in jest. Because some of those premises are holy shit. They are quite outlandish. Quite outlandish. Master N, thank you for the 2. But oh wait, no, I already read that one out. Macarius, thank you for the 5. Monetizing the novelty of a furniture-based drama achiever. Very much appreciated. Macarius, thank you for the 2. The chairman is about encouraging prejudice. Yes, I am. Yes, I am. I've often said that one of the best sales pitches that you can give for my channel, which is ideal in actually summarizing what it is I do, while also filtering out people who might not enjoy the content at all, is I am someone who encourages. I'm here to encourage prejudice, exclusion, and stigma. Like that. That's what I do here. And again, I suppose one of the biggest filters for my channel is, are you able to perceive those things as tools to be used, rather than just like this sort of secular Satan that must be avoided at all costs. Xanthropy, I recommend watching The Degeneracy of Modern Writing by the second story. I've had that on my recommended a few times over the past few months, so I might end up checking that one out at some point in the near future. 3 cheers for prejudice. Again, most people don't. Well, people practice prejudice all the time. It's just whether they admit that that's what's going on or not, right? And again, prejudice is on its own. It is just. It's literally in the word itself, right? To prejudge something, and that's a pretty neutral concept. It just depends on how good your data is, and how much of it you have. I think that's all of the supers. Now with the memberships, unfortunately, hold on, let me see if YouTube has somewhere where I can see the membership messages that are being left. Hold on. I think I read them all out, but I may have missed 1 or 2. Hopefully the next time I boot up the stream, after I'm done with the main section, I can go back into stream elements and it'll actually be working, so I can catch up if I missed any. If Ram Ranch wasn't a meme song, it would be an unironic 2025 romance novel. Oh, I'm sure it is. Just not by the same name. I'm almost certain that there is some smuts AI slop novel that exists out on Amazon or something that is just, the premise is just Ram Ranch. I still need to pick up Stellar Blade, but my 4070 chugged at the opening to the first boss fight. I'm sorry for your loss. Misread portion of bookstores as person of bookstore. Understandable mistake, to be honest. I'm sure it is just under a different name. Yeah. Rima's birthday is in 5 hours. We're making sure she has frosting this time. Oh, fuck. Oh, wait, hopefully it's a bit longer. It's a bit on the longer side than just like, you know. Well, actually, if it's as long as her Cinder streams, I think I will be able to wake up in time to at least join the tail end of that. But yeah, man, I've been one of the things about this. One of the things about this this content niche that is how do I say? This isn't really a complaint because this is something I chose for myself, but it is very you go through periods where it becomes very difficult to sort of switch your brain off and find time to just sit down and enjoy a fucking stream. And it usually happens in like small sections of, you know, days at a time. In the most severe cases, it goes on for weeks. But there's sort of an element where you kind of one of the one of the things that I had to figure out how to do relatively early on into occupying this, carving out this niche, this content niche, was trying to figure out that on and off switch for just thinking about the topics that I was planning on covering. Because it gets to stages occasionally where there's like a, you know, it's like that thing where you start going down a rabbit hole and your brain just won't let you stop until you're right at the bottom, or at least you feel like you've reached the bottom or whatever. It's kind of like that, but it makes it difficult to just sit back and enjoy something. Oh shit! Yes, yeah, it is like 2. It is something like 2 a.m. over here. So yeah. On that note, I am going to end the stream here. Hold on, let me find someone to raid actually before I end the stream. Let me see who's live right now. Does anyone have any recommendations of indie VTubers to raid at the moment, who are online or who are live at the moment? Because I don't have anybody on my end of things. Are we raiding? I feel like it's a bit early. I've raided into waiting rooms before, and I think 5 hours is a little excessive. I remember raiding into one of Rima's waiting rooms for, I think, either one of her streams or one of her upcoming videos that was still like 1 day away. So, yeah. Pillow Deer? Okay. Pillow Deer or Honolulu? Alright, let me see if they have raids enabled from anybody. Hold on, let me... Oh, okay. Alright. I've never watched Pillow Deer before, but let's raid into her. I don't think I've raided into her before. Alright. That time was hilarious. Yes, but it was a little embarrassing. Alright. So, as usual, when you're in somebody else's stream, don't carry what we talked about in here into there. Make sure to behave. I want you guys to blend in seamlessly with whatever it is she's doing. And yeah, thank you for tuning into this stream. I hope if this is the first time that you've watched any of my content, that this was at least somewhat palatable sampler. And I will be putting the waiting room up for part 2 later on. Later on today, I should say, because it is now the next day over. And yeah, thank you for watching. Hope you found this to be entertaining and or informative. And Otsu Chair.